I flew across the country to stand outside a church on the most important day of my father's new life. I thought I was there to witness a new beginning and perhaps find some small measure of closure. Instead, I found myself blocked at the heavy oak doors of St. Patrick's Cathedral by the man who gave me life. He looked me dead in the eye, adjusted his custom tuxedo, and said the words that would end our relationship forever. "You are not invited. Go home." He said it while his new bride smiled a sugary, venomous smile, completely unaware that I was holding a piece of paper that could send her perfect groom to federal prison. Before I tell you exactly what was in that frayed envelope and how I brought a fake millionaire to his knees, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you believe that the truth always comes to light. Drop a comment right now and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love reading your comments. Now let me take you back to the steps of that cathedral right where the ultimate betrayal began. My name is Clara. I am 28 years old and I work as a senior auditor in Chicago. My job is to look at massive corporate ledgers, uncover hidden financial truths, and find the subtle discrepancies that desperate people try to hide. I deal in hard facts, in uncompromising numbers, and in cold reality. But for the absolute longest time, I was completely and utterly blind to the massive discrepancies occurring right inside my own family. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon in late October, the kind of sharp autumn day in the wealthy Chicago suburbs where the air feels electric and the falling leaves perfectly match the gold accents on the luxury cars pulling into the VIP parking lot. I stood at the bottom of the grand stone steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral. This was an exclusive high society parish. The architecture was incredibly imposing, featuring massive stained glass windows and heavy, exquisitely carved oak doors that looked like they belonged on a European fortress rather than a suburban church. I was certainly not dressed for a high society wedding. I wore a simple navy blue tailored suit, the exact kind of practical, no-nonsense outfit I would wear to a tense corporate board meeting or a grueling financial review. I had flown in early that morning, my stomach tied in agonizing knots driven by a foolish, lingering sense of duty. A daughter should be at her father's wedding. That is what society tells us. That is the cultural expectation we are all fed. Even after everything he had put me through, even after the cold, calculating distance he had maintained for 5 long years, I still held on to a tiny, fragile sliver of hope that blood meant something to him. I climbed the stone steps, slowly feeling the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made pressing down on my shoulders. The sounds of a live string quartet drifted out from the grand vestibule, mixing seamlessly with the low, cultured murmurs of hundreds of wealthy guests. Women in expensive silk dresses and men in tailored Italian suits brushed past me without a second glance. I recognized some of them. Former business associates, elite country club members, people who used to come to our house for summer barbecues back when my mother was still alive and our family was still whole. None of them recognized me. I had been erased from the family narrative so thoroughly and so effectively that I was essentially a ghost haunting a celebration of the living. As I reached the upper landing, the massive oak doors were propped wide open, revealing a sanctuary overflowing with white roses and glowing candlelight. I stepped toward the entrance, my heart pounding a steady, nervous rhythm against my ribs. I took a deep breath, preparing to walk quietly down the side aisle and find an inconspicuous seat in the very back row. I just wanted to sit in the shadows and watch, but I did not make it past the threshold. Suddenly, a tall figure stepped out from the shadows of the vestibule, moving with deliberate speed to block the entrance completely. It was my father, Thomas. He looked absolutely immaculate. His custom black tuxedo fit his frame perfectly. His silver hair was styled with absolute precision, and he wore a vintage gold watch that I recognized instantly. It was a watch that was supposed to have been sold years ago to pay off crushing medical debts. He stepped squarely into the exact center of the doorway. He spread his arms slightly, creating a physical, unyielding barrier between me and the sanctuary. The warm, fatherly, charming smile he had just been flashing to the arriving guests vanished the absolute second his eyes locked onto mine. His face hardened into a mask of pure, unforgiving ice. "What are you doing here, Clara?" His voice was a harsh, aggressive whisper, expertly modulated to carry only to my ears, but laced with an unmistakable toxic venom. I stood there genuinely stunned. The sheer hostility in his tone felt like a physical blow to the chest. "I am your daughter," I said, working hard to keep my voice steady, despite the sudden betraying trembling in my hands. "I came to see you get married. I thought you would want me here today." Thomas scoffed. It was a short, bitter, ugly sound. "You thought wrong. You are not a part of this life. You are not a part of this family anymore." I stared at him, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer cruelty of his words. Guests were still filing in, stepping carefully around us, casting curious, scrutinizing glances at the tense standoff occurring right at the main entrance of the cathedral. I could feel the crushing weight of their upper-class judgment pressing down on me. Hundreds of eyes were watching the scene unfold, calculating the drama, whispering behind manicured hands and expensive silk purses. He leaned in closer, his jaw tight with barely suppressed rage. "I told you to stay away. You do not fit in here. You are going to ruin the aesthetic of the entire day. You are not invited. Go home." The words hit me with the devastating force of a freight train. "You are not invited. Go home." A father telling his own flesh and blood to turn around and walk away because she did not fit the visual aesthetic of his new fabricated life. He spoke to me as if I were a pest, a stray animal that had wandered onto his manicured lawn and was tracking mud onto his pristine porch. There was no hesitation in his voice, no guilt in his posture, no remorse in his cold eyes, just pure, unadulterated annoyance. Before I could even process the shock of that rejection, a woman stepped up from behind him, placing a highly possessive, perfectly manicured hand on his shoulder. It was Cynthia, the new bride. She was wearing a custom designer wedding gown dripping with intricate lace that must have cost more than my entire college tuition. Her blonde hair was swept up into an elaborate, flawless updo, and her neck was draped in heavy, glittering diamonds. She looked me up and down, her eyes raking over my practical navy suit, my sensible flat shoes, my minimal everyday makeup. A condescending, mocking smirk slowly spread across her face. It was the exact kind of sneer reserved for someone scraping mud off the bottom of their expensive designer shoes. "Is there a problem here, Tommy?" Cynthia asked, her voice dripping with fake sugary concern that masked her obvious disdain. "Who is this woman causing a scene at our church on our special day?" My father did not even flinch. He did not introduce me. He did not claim me. "Just someone who has overstayed her welcome, darling. I am handling it. Please go back inside." Right behind Cynthia stood her two adult children, Brad and Chloe. They were the physical, breathing embodiments of extreme entitlement. Brad, wearing a tuxedo that perfectly matched my father's, was checking his own reflection in the glass of the vestibule door. Chloe, dressed in a lavish, heavily beaded bridesmaid gown, was casually holding a glass of champagne. She had clearly sneaked out to the lobby before the ceremony even began. They both looked at me like I was a beggar who had crawled out of the city gutters just to interrupt their royal coronation. Brad let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed in the stone entryway. "Seriously, Thomas, are you running a neighborhood charity program at the church door now? Tell the little auditor to go crunch her numbers somewhere else. We have an expensive reception to get to, and she's ruining the vibe." Chloe rolled her eyes drastically and took a slow, arrogant sip of her champagne. "God, this is so incredibly embarrassing for us. Just call the private security and have her tossed out into the street. She looks like she is about to ask us for a handout to pay her rent." I stood completely frozen on the cathedral steps. My father, the man who had raised me from childhood, the man who had cried on my shoulder when my mother died, did not defend me. He did not raise his voice to reprimand his new stepchildren for openly insulting his biological daughter. Instead, he simply nodded in quiet agreement. "You heard them, Clara," my father said, his voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth or basic human decency. "You are making an absolute fool of yourself in front of my guests. Leave quietly right now, or I will have the ushers physically remove you from the premises." For 10 long, agonizing seconds, I did not move a single muscle. I just looked at the four of them standing there in their incredibly expensive clothes, wrapped tightly in a protective bubble of stolen wealth and profound arrogance. I felt a very familiar, deep burning sensation rising rapidly in my chest. It was the exact same burning pain I had felt for the last 5 years. I felt it every single time I transferred my hard-earned auditor paycheck into his bank account to save him from supposed financial ruin. I felt it every time I ate cheap instant noodles in a freezing cramped apartment so he could supposedly pay off his crushing medical debts. I felt it every time I sacrificed my own comfort, my own youth, and my own peace of mind just to keep his head above water. But as I stood there, under the cold, scrutinizing gaze of the Chicago elite, the pain suddenly stopped. The familiar grief vanished completely. The desperate, pathetic, childlike hope that my father would finally see my worth and love me evaporated into the crisp autumn air like smoke. In its place, a profound, absolute, terrifying clarity settled over my mind. I am an auditor. I am highly trained to look past the shiny surface, to ignore the flashy, distracting presentations, and to locate the missing numbers. I am trained to expose the lie no matter how deeply it is buried. And standing right before me was the biggest, most grotesque lie of all. Thomas thought I was weak. He thought the quiet, obedient, dutiful daughter who had sacrificed absolutely everything for him would just lower her head in shame, turn around and cry all the way back to her cheap apartment. He thought I would quietly protect his reputation, the way I had always protected him from the harsh realities of the world. He thought my silence was guaranteed. He was entirely wrong. I did not cry. I did not turn away. I stood my ground on the stone steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral, anchoring myself to the reality I knew was true. I looked directly at Cynthia's smug, punchable smile. I looked at Brad and Chloe's mocking, arrogant faces. And finally, I looked deep into my father's cold, dismissive eyes. Slowly, deliberately, without breaking eye contact with the man who was throwing me away, I reached my right hand into my structured leather briefcase. My fingers brushed past my wallet, past my keys, sliding deep into the hidden zipper pocket in the back. I felt the rough, frayed edge of an old, heavy manila envelope. It was the envelope I had carefully carried with me on the cross-country flight. The envelope I had kept locked inside a secure safe for an entire month. The envelope that contained a handwritten letter penned on expensive, personalized stationery. As my fingers gripped the thick paper, my mind flashed back to the chaotic night he had written it. The night he had collapsed on the hardwood floor of his study, weeping uncontrollably, desperately, grabbing my hands and begging me to show him mercy. He had knelt before me, tears streaming down his perfectly aged face, pleading with me to bury the truth forever, to hide his massive crimes, to let him keep his grand illusion alive just a little bit longer. I had almost listened to him out of pity. I had almost walked away today out of a misplaced sense of family loyalty. But looking at him now, standing tall and proud, aggressively blocking the door to the church, surrounded by the arrogant people who were gleefully spending the money that rightfully belonged to me, I knew that mercy was no longer an option on the table. He had made his cruel choice. Now I was going deeply, irrevocably into mine. I gripped the envelope tightly and pulled it out of my bag into the autumn sunlight. To truly understand the explosive, devastating weight of what was written inside that letter and why it was about to absolutely destroy this perfect wedding and send an entire fake empire crashing to the ground, you have to understand the massive deception that started 5 years ago. You have to understand the monstrous lie my father told me on the exact day my mother died, the lie that forced me into years of financial slavery, and the shocking world-altering discovery I made inside a forgotten bank vault that changed the trajectory of my entire life. 5 years ago, my world did not just fall apart. It was systematically dismantled by the man who was supposed to protect me. I was 23 years old, fresh out of college, clutching an accounting degree that felt entirely useless as I sat beside a sterile hospital bed. My mother, Sarah, was dying. Her battle with illness had been agonizing, a slow fading of the brightest light our family had ever known. When the monitors finally flatlined and the room plunged into that deafening, permanent silence, I thought my father and I would cling to each other to survive the grief. Thomas played his part with absolute perfection. At her funeral, he was the picture of a devastated, heartbroken widower. He wept openly, leaning heavily on my shoulder, accepting the quiet condolences of our neighbors with a trembling voice. I believed every single tear. I believed his sorrow was as deep and suffocating as my own. But the very next morning before the funeral, flowers had even begun to wilt. His performance abruptly ended. He called me into the kitchen. The air was stale, smelling of cold coffee and lingering grief. He had spread a massive stack of papers across the oak dining table. They looked like medical bills, final notices, and bank statements printed in terrifying red ink. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not offer a comforting hug. He simply pointed to the papers with a shaking finger and delivered the lie that would dictate the next 5 years of my life. He told me we were completely ruined. He said my mother's treatments had drained every single savings account, every retirement fund, and every hidden reserve we possessed. He looked me straight in the eyes, his expression a masterclass in defeated resignation, and said he was facing imminent bankruptcy. Then came the killing blow. He told me I had to pack my things and leave immediately. I cannot provide for you anymore, he said, his voice completely hollow. I cannot even afford to keep the electricity running in this house for much longer. You have to go, Clara. You have to fend for yourself because I have absolutely nothing left to give you. I was a grieving daughter who had just buried her mother 24 hours prior. I did not question the math. I did not ask to audit the statements he had scattered across the table. I just saw a broken man drowning in debt, and my heart shattered for him. I packed my meager belongings into 2 suitcases, hugged him goodbye, and walked out the door, determined to save him from the financial ruin he claimed was suffocating him. I threw myself into my work with a manic, desperate intensity. Standard corporate auditing jobs in comfortable air-conditioned offices in Chicago paid decently, but they did not pay nearly enough to rescue a man from the kind of massive crushing debt my father had described. I needed hazard pay. I needed overseas per diems. I needed the kind of extreme contracts that other auditors flatly refused to take. I applied for and secured field auditing positions for massive high-risk international infrastructure projects. I traded the safety of a desk for the grueling, punishing reality of extreme environments. For months on end, I lived out of a duffel bag, traveling to some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet just to verify construction budgets and material costs for global engineering firms. I spent an entire season stationed high in the Himalayas, auditing supply chains along the Sakh Pass. The conditions were absolutely brutal. I remember waking up in a freezing, uninsulated tent, my breath pluming in the icy air, my fingers so numb I could barely type on my laptop keyboard. I traveled along treacherous, narrow mountain roads where a single mistake by our driver meant plunging thousands of feet into the gorge below. I reviewed massive logistical ledgers while fighting severe altitude sickness, gasping for thin air, forcing my brain to focus on the numbers, because every extra dollar I earned was a dollar that would keep my father out of poverty. I risked my life on those sheer collapsing cliffs, motivated entirely by the image of my father sitting alone in a dark, cold house in Illinois. When the Sakh Pass project ended, I immediately took another grueling assignment in Japan, auditing the massive snow clearing operations along the Tateyama-Kurobe route. While tourists marveled at the towering 60-foot snow walls, I was isolated in a cramped, freezing administrative bunker, crunching numbers until my vision blurred. I worked 20-hour days reviewing fuel expenditures, heavy machinery, maintenance logs, and labor costs. The isolation was profound. I missed Thanksgiving. I missed Christmas. I missed every normal milestone a young woman in her 20s should experience. I had no social life, no romantic relationships, no time to even mourn my mother properly. Every single time I received my paycheck, including the massive hazard bonuses I earned for enduring those extreme conditions, I logged into my banking app and wired 90% of it directly to Thomas's account. I kept only enough to pay for my cheap instant meals and my basic necessities. Over the course of 5 grueling years, I sent him hundreds of thousands of dollars. I bled for that money. I froze for it. I sacrificed my youth, my health, and my peace of mind for it. Every transfer felt like I was throwing a life preserver to a drowning man. I truly believed I was saving his life. But illusions, no matter how brilliantly constructed, eventually begin to crack. The first subtle fracture happened about 8 months ago, shortly after I had returned to the States from another exhausting overseas contract. I was bone-tired, living in a tiny, cheap apartment on the outskirts of the city, eating canned soup for dinner. I called my father to check on him, hoping to hear that the suffocating debt was finally easing. He sounded different. The defeated, hollow tone he had used for years was gone. He sounded vibrant, relaxed, even jovial. He casually mentioned that he was exhausted from playing a full 18 holes that afternoon. He complained about a minor ache in his shoulder from his golf swing. He mentioned a dinner reservation at a high-end steakhouse. When I gently asked how he could afford such things, he quickly backpedaled, claiming a generous old friend had treated him out of pity. He changed the subject rapidly, but my auditor's brain, trained to detect the smallest inconsistencies in any narrative, immediately locked onto that discrepancy. A man drowning in medical bankruptcy does not complain about his golf swing. Late that night, sitting in the dark of my cheap apartment, I opened my laptop. I had never bothered to look up my father's social footprint before, because I assumed there was nothing to see but misery. But driven by a sudden sickening intuition, I began to search. I looked up the local country clubs in his area. I scoured their public event galleries and digital newsletters. It only took me an hour to find what I was dreading. There he was. Thomas, the man I had been freezing in the mountains to save, standing on the lush manicured green of the highly exclusive Oak Brook Country Club. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that must have cost thousands. He was holding a crystal glass of premium scotch, throwing his head back in a carefree, booming laugh surrounded by other wealthy men. I clicked through gallery after gallery, my heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I saw photos of him at charity galas, at private wine tastings, at exclusive yacht club dinners. And in almost every recent photo, there was a woman clinging tightly to his arm. Cynthia. The captions in the society pages described her as a prominent local widow, a fixture of the suburban elite. And they described Thomas not as a bankrupt grieving widower, but as a successful retired real estate investor. They were hailed as the new power couple of the country club circuit. The physical revulsion that hit me was so intense, I actually had to run to my bathroom and be sick. I sank to the cold tile floor, clutching my stomach, as the horrifying reality of my entire adult life washed over me. The grueling months in the thin, freezing air of the Himalayas, the numbing isolation of the snow-covered routes in Japan, the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had wired to him, believing I was keeping the lights on and the debt collectors at bay. None of it was paying off medical debt. There was no bankruptcy. There were no debt collectors. The money I had bled for the youth I had sacrificed had been used entirely to fund a lavish aristocratic lifestyle. I had been directly financing his entry into the elite. I had been paying for his custom suits, his premium scotch, his golf club memberships, and his luxurious dates with a woman who claimed to be high society. I was not throwing a life preserver to a drowning man. I was filling the swimming pool on his luxury yacht. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of his deception was paralyzing. He had watched me pack my bags in tears, knowing exactly what he was doing. He had accepted every single wire transfer, knowing I was risking my life in hazardous conditions to send it. He had played me for an absolute fool. But as I sat there on the bathroom floor, the initial shock began to curdle into a deep, calculating anger. My professional instincts kicked into overdrive. I am an auditor. I track the flow of capital. I know exactly how much money I sent him over 5 years. It was a substantial amount, enough to buy expensive suits and pay country club dues. But it was absolutely not enough to sustain the kind of extreme, multimillionaire lifestyle he was projecting to Cynthia and her wealthy social circle. It was not enough to afford $250,000 wedding at St. Patrick's Cathedral. The math simply did not add up. There was a massive gaping hole in the ledger of my father's life. If he was throwing around hundreds of thousands of dollars to impress a high society widow, and my hazard pay was only covering a fraction of it, where was the rest of the money coming from? I realized that the fake bankruptcy and the country club facade were only the very top layer of the deception. There was a much deeper, much darker financial current flowing beneath the surface. My father was hiding a massive source of capital, something he had deliberately kept hidden since the exact moment my mother passed away. I dried my face, stood up, and walked back to my computer. The grieving, obedient daughter who had unquestioningly packed her bags 5 years ago was dead. In her place was a senior auditor who had just found a massive discrepancy in the books. I was going to find out exactly where the real money came from, no matter what stones I had to overturn. And that intense, burning need for the truth is exactly what led me to the bank 1 week later, to a forgotten safe deposit box that held a secret so devastating it would blow my father's entire fake empire to dust. It started exactly 1 month before the wedding. I received a certified letter forwarded from my old college address. It was from the First National Bank of Chicago. The letter was addressed to the estate of Sarah, my late mother. It stated that a safe deposit box in her name was about to expire due to unpaid annual fees, and its contents would soon be sent to the state as unclaimed property. Because I was listed as the secondary name on the original lease document from over a decade ago, the bank had finally tracked me down as a last resort. Thomas had clearly forgotten this box even existed. When a liar spins a web that massive, they inevitably leave a loose thread. This was his. I drove to the bank on a rainy Tuesday morning. My mind was already racing with 1,000 different scenarios, but nothing could have prepared me for what was actually waiting inside that steel vault. I presented my identification and my mother's death certificate to the branch manager. He led me down a quiet carpeted hallway and into the heavily fortified vault room. He unlocked the master side, and I used the small brass key I had found years ago in my mother's jewelry box, a key I had always kept on my keyring, purely out of sentimental attachment. The manager pulled out a long, heavy metal drawer and carried it into a private viewing room for me. He closed the solid oak door, leaving me completely alone in the absolute silence. I sat down at the polished mahogany table. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lift the lid of the metal box. I did not know what I was expecting to find. Perhaps some old family heirlooms, a few pieces of antique jewelry, or maybe some sentimental photographs my mother had wanted to protect. But when I finally opened the lid, there was no jewelry. There were only thick, cream-colored legal envelopes. My professional instincts instantly took over. I am an auditor. I deal in documentation. I took a deep breath, steadied my hands, and began to carefully lay the documents out on the table, organizing them chronologically. The very first document I opened was a massive trust agreement. As I read the incredibly dense legal terminology, my heart completely stopped beating in my chest. My maternal grandfather, a quiet man who had lived modestly and died when I was just a little girl, had not been a simple working-class man. He had been quietly, astoundingly wealthy. He had established a massive trust fund. I stared at the bold numbers printed on the second page, blinking hard, convinced my eyes were playing a cruel trick on me. The trust was valued at over $4 million. My mother was not poor. Our family had not been surviving on just a mechanic's salary. My mother was the sole beneficiary of a $4 million fortune. The air in the private viewing room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I could not breathe. I frantically tore open the second envelope. It contained my mother's original notarized last will and testament. It was dated just 3 weeks before her health took a rapid, fatal decline. I read her familiar, elegant handwriting on the margins. The legal text was crystal clear. My mother had explicitly bypassed Thomas. She knew exactly what kind of man my father truly was when money was involved. Her will legally mandated that the entire $4 million trust, along with all associated liquid assets, was to be held securely and transferred directly and solely to me, Clara, on my 25th birthday. My father was legally entitled to absolutely nothing. I was 28 years old. I should have received that money 3 years ago. I should have never had to freeze in the mountains of Japan. I should have never had to starve in a tiny apartment. I was a millionaire. A wave of sheer violent nausea washed over me. If the money was legally mine, and my mother had explicitly cut Thomas out of the will, how on earth did he gain access to the funds to pay for his custom suits, his luxury country club memberships, and his fake aristocratic lifestyle? I dug deeper into the metal box, my fingers numb and clumsy. The answer was in the third envelope. It contained a power of attorney document and a series of complex estate transfer forms. I studied the signatures closely. I am trained to look for discrepancies, and this one was glaringly obvious. The signature on the power of attorney did not match the flowing, elegant script of my mother's true handwriting on her will. It was jagged, forced, and completely fraudulent. Thomas had forged her signature. As my mother lay dying in her hospital bed, heavily medicated and completely incapacitated, the man who had sworn to protect her had brought in a corrupt notary. He had forged a comprehensive power of attorney. He had used that fraudulent document to completely alter the structure of the trust right before she drew her last breath, naming himself as the primary and sole trustee. He had deliberately hidden her true original will inside this forgotten safe deposit box, relying on the fact that he was the only one who knew about the grandfather's money. He knew that as long as he convinced me we were completely ruined by medical bankruptcy, I would be far too busy trying to survive to ever go looking for a massive fortune I did not know existed. He had stolen $4 million from his own grieving daughter. I sat in that private bank room for 2 solid hours, completely paralyzed by the sheer monstrous magnitude of his betrayal. My father had not just lied to me, he had financially enslaved me. He had watched me pack my bags in tears, knowing he had millions sitting in a trust. He had let me fly to the most dangerous, isolated corners of the globe, knowing I was risking my physical safety just to send him money. But then a new, incredibly disturbing question pierced through my shock. If Thomas had stolen a $4 million trust, why did he still need my money? Why did he accept every single wire transfer I sent him for my grueling overseas audits? $4 million is a massive amount of money, but as an auditor, I know that wealth tied up in aggressive real estate investments, elite, country club initiation fees, and luxury asset purchases is often entirely illiquid. Thomas was asset-rich, but cash-poor. He was living drastically beyond his means to impress Cynthia and maintain his fake billionaire facade. I opened my laptop right there in the bank room. I logged into my personal banking portal and pulled up the detailed history of every single wire transfer I had sent to my father over the last 5 years. Then I cross-referenced those exact dates with the social media accounts I had found the night before. I looked at the digital footprint of Cynthia's 2 incredibly entitled adult children, Brad and Chloe. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. The math aligned perfectly. On November 12th, I had wired $3,000 to my father from a freezing tent in the Himalayas, believing it was going toward a final notice on his heating bill. On November 14th, Chloe posted a photo on social media showing off a brand new limited edition Prada handbag that retailed for exactly $2,800. On March 3rd, I had sent $4,000 from a cramped administrative bunker in Japan, entirely convinced I was saving his house from foreclosure. On March 5th, Brad posted a video popping a bottle of expensive champagne on a luxury ski trip in Aspen, bragging about his fully funded vacation. The money I bled for, the cash I earned by sacrificing my youth and my health in the most punishing conditions on earth, was not going toward my father's debts. It was not even going toward my father's lifestyle. My hazard pay was entirely liquid cash, and Thomas was using it as literal pocket money to pacify his new fiancé's lazy, unemployed adult children. I was fully funding the luxurious, carefree lifestyles of 2 absolute strangers who had never worked a single hard day in their entire miserable lives. I was paying for Chloe's designer bags. I was paying for Brad's luxury vacations and expensive car leases. My father had turned his own biological daughter into an unpaid, suffering laborer just so he could buy the affection of a fake high society widow and her 2 parasitic children. I looked at the original will sitting on the mahogany table. I looked at the forged power of attorney. The grief and the sorrow that had weighed me down for 5 long years instantly evaporated. I was no longer a sad, abandoned daughter mourning the loss of a father. I was a senior financial auditor looking at a massive, undeniably documented case of wire fraud, grand larceny, and the misappropriation of a multi-million-dollar trust. Thomas had built a magnificent, glittering house of cards on a foundation of absolute lies. He believed he was untouchable because he thought I was weak. He thought I was just the invisible, dutiful girl who would accept whatever narrative he handed her. I carefully placed the original will, the trust documents, and the forged power of attorney back into their heavy envelopes. I placed them inside my structured leather briefcase and zipped it shut. I walked out of the vault, thanked the bank manager, and stepped out into the crisp Chicago air. My father was currently busy tasting expensive wedding cakes and picking out floral arrangements for a $250,000 wedding. He thought his biggest problem was making sure his suit matched Cynthia's extravagant gown. He had absolutely no idea that his invisible, discarded daughter was currently holding the exact legal documents required to freeze every single asset he falsely claimed to own, dismantle his entire fake empire, and send him to federal prison. The financial audit of Thomas's life had officially begun, and I was going to enjoy tearing his world apart, ledger by ledger. I left the heavy steel doors of the First National Bank of Chicago with my leather briefcase clutched tightly against my chest. Inside that bag was the absolute destruction of my father. The drive to his house in the affluent northern suburbs took 45 minutes, but it felt like an entire lifetime. With every single mile that passed, the naive, grieving daughter I used to be faded further into the rearview mirror, In her place sat a cold, calculating auditor who had just uncovered a multi-million-dollar fraud orchestrated by her own flesh and blood. I pulled up to his massive, sprawling colonial estate. This was the house he supposedly could not afford to keep the lights on in 5 years ago. Now it featured perfectly manicured lawns, a newly paved circular driveway, and a custom water feature bubbling peacefully near the grand front door. Every single brick, every blade of grass was paid for by the trust fund he stole from me and the hazard pay I bled for in the freezing, unforgiving mountains of Japan. I did not bother knocking. I still had the spare key he had given me years ago, back when he needed me to come over and clean the house on my rare, exhausted weekends back in the States. I unlocked the heavy mahogany door and stepped into the grand foyer. The house smelled of expensive cedar and fresh lilies. I could hear him in his private study talking loudly on the phone, aggressively negotiating the price of imported champagne for his upcoming wedding reception. I walked silently down the hallway and stood in the doorway of his study, watching him perform his role as the wealthy commanding patriarch. He wore a crisp, tailored dress shirt, casually unbuttoned at the collar, completely at ease in his stolen kingdom. When he finally hung up the phone and noticed me standing there, his face immediately tightened with intense, dismissive annoyance. "Clara, what on earth are you doing here?" he sighed, rubbing his temples, as if my mere presence was a massive, exhausting burden. "I am incredibly busy with the wedding planners today. I do not have time for a social visit." I did not say a single word. I walked straight into his study, approached his massive oak desk, and unzipped my briefcase. 5 years ago, on the morning after my mother's funeral, he had spread a pile of fake medical bills across a kitchen table to convince me we were ruined. Today, I was going to return the favor. I reached into my bag and pulled out the crisp, clean photocopies I had made just 30 minutes earlier at a print shop down the street from the bank. I laid them out on his desk with slow, deliberate precision. I placed the massive trust document on the left. I placed my mother's true original will in the center. And finally, I placed the forged power of attorney document squarely on the right. I stepped back, crossed my arms, and looked at him. "I think it is time we had an audit of your finances, Thomas," I said, my voice completely stripped of any emotion. I watched his eyes drop to the desk. I watched the exact devastating moment his brain processed what he was looking at. It was a fascinating psychological collapse. The color drained out of his face so fast he looked physically ill. His tan, healthy complexion turned a sickening shade of ash gray. His jaw went slack and his eyes darted frantically from the original will to the forged signature. Then back to my face. The arrogant, wealthy gentleman completely vanished, replaced entirely by a terrified, cornered animal. "Where did you get these?" His voice was barely a choked whisper. He reached out with a trembling hand hovering over the documents, but absolutely too terrified to actually touch them. "I got them from the safe deposit box you forgot to renew," I replied, staring directly into his panicked eyes. "The one in my mother's name. The one where you hid her real will before you brought in a fake notary to forge her signature on her deathbed. You stole $4 million from your own daughter, Thomas. And then you looked me in the eye, told me you were bankrupt, and let me freeze in the Himalayas just so you could use my paycheck as pocket money for your new fiancé's lazy children." He tried to speak, but only a pathetic, raspy sound came out. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the leather armchair behind him. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Then the performance began. Thomas let out a loud, agonizing sob and collapsed perfectly to his knees right there on the expensive Persian rug. He buried his face in his hands, weeping violently, his shoulders shaking with massive theatrical heaves. "Clara, please, you have to understand," he cried, crawling awkwardly toward my shoes. "I was desperate. When your mother got sick, the business investments I had made started tanking. I was terrified of losing everything. I just wanted to protect our lifestyle. I just wanted to keep things stable. I never meant to hurt you." I stood there looking down at the man who had raised me, feeling absolutely nothing but profound disgust. "You did not protect our lifestyle," I said coldly. "You threw me out onto the street. You forced me to live out of a duffel bag and risk my life on dangerous auditing contracts so you could play golf and buy expensive suits. You let me believe I was the only thing keeping you from starving." Thomas grabbed the hem of my suit jacket, his face completely wet with tears. I am so sorry, Clara. I am so incredibly sorry. Please, I will do anything. Anything you want. Just tell me how to fix this. Please do not turn these over to the authorities. I will go to federal prison. I will lose absolutely everything. He was sobbing so hard. He was practically choking. But my professional instincts were fully engaged. I knew that a man this manipulative, a man who could look his grieving daughter in the eye and lie about a fake bankruptcy, would deny everything the absolute second I walked out the door. He would claim I forged the copies. He would claim he knew nothing about the trust. I needed him locked in. I needed irrefutable proof of his guilt from his own hand. I grabbed a pen and a piece of his expensive, personalized stationery from the desk and threw them down on the floor right in front of him. Write it down, I commanded, my voice echoing sharply off the walls of the study. If you are truly sorry, you will write a full detailed confession right now. You will write exactly what you did. You will state that you forged the power of attorney, that you hid my mother's real will, and that you illegally accessed the $4 million trust that rightfully belonged to me. Write it, sign it, and date it. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. Clara, please, that is a legal death sentence. You cannot ask me to do that. I crossed my arms, my posture unyielding. You write it right now, or I will call the police from this exact spot and have them escort you out of this stolen house in handcuffs. The choice is entirely yours. Trembling violently, Thomas slowly picked up the pen. Sniffling and wiping his nose on his expensive tailored sleeve, he began to write. I stood over him, watching him actively document his own destruction. It took him 5 agonizing minutes to write out the full truth. He detailed the forgery, the hidden safe deposit box, and the systematic theft of my inheritance. When he finally finished, he signed his name with a shaking hand and pushed the paper toward my feet. I picked it up, read it carefully to ensure it contained every single necessary admission of his massive fraud, and folded it neatly into my jacket pocket. As soon as the paper was safely in my pocket, the atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. Thomas slowly stood up, brushing the invisible lint off his knees. He wiped his face, taking a deep, shuddering breath, trying to rapidly assemble a brand new strategy. The pathetic, weeping father vanished, replaced by a calculating schemer. He looked at me with a sickening, desperate gleam in his eyes. Clara, listen to me, he pleaded, holding his hands up in a gesture of negotiation. You have the confession. You have all the power. But I have a brilliant solution that will make us both incredibly wealthy. You just have to listen to my plan. I stared at him, genuinely appalled that he was attempting to negotiate a corrupt business deal mere seconds after confessing to grand larceny. What absolute nonsense are you talking about now? I asked, my voice laced with venom. He took a step closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Cynthia, he whispered, his eyes wide with frantic, greedy calculation. Cynthia is worth over $10 million, Clara. Her late husband left her a massive, sprawling estate. We are getting married in exactly 1 month. Once we are legally married, our assets will formally merge. I will have full legal access to all of her accounts. He actually smiled then. It was a twisted, horrific smile that made my stomach completely turn. It was the smile of a predator who thought he had just found a brilliant loophole. All I am asking is for you to give me 30 days, he continued, his tone turning smooth and persuasive. Just keep quiet for 1 single month. Let me walk down that aisle. Let me secure the marriage certificate. As soon as I have access to Cynthia's millions, I will wire the entire $4 million directly into your personal account. I will even add $1 million extra for your trouble. You will get everything back with interest, and I will get to keep my new life. It is a perfect solution. Nobody has to go to jail. Nobody has to lose their reputation. We both win. I looked at the man standing before me, truly seeing the absolute rotting core of his soul for the very first time. He was not just a thief. He was a complete and utter sociopath. He had stolen from his dead wife, he had financially enslaved his own biological daughter, and now he was actively plotting to heavily defraud the woman he was about to marry just to cover up his previous crimes. He wanted me to become an active accomplice in a massive financial scam against his new bride. He truly believed that I was just as morally bankrupt as he was. You are completely out of your mind, I said, my voice dripping with pure, uncompromising contempt. You actually want me to sit back and watch you defraud another woman just so you can pay me back with stolen money. I will never be an accomplice to your pathetic criminal schemes. I am taking what is legally mine, Thomas, and I am not waiting a single day. The transformation was instantaneous and utterly terrifying. The second he realized I was not going to play his twisted game, the desperate negotiating father vanished completely. His posture straightened abruptly. His chest puffed out. The cold, arrogant monster returned with a vengeance. "You ungrateful little brat," he spat, his voice dropping into a vicious, aggressive snarl. "I gave you a roof over your head for 18 years. I fed you. I clothed you. If you dare take those documents to a lawyer, I will absolutely destroy you." He stepped directly into my personal space, towering over me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me the way he used to when I was a child. But I did not shrink back. I held my ground, staring directly into his furious eyes. "I have powerful friends in this city, Clara." He threatened, his face turning a dark shade of red. "I know corporate partners. I know elite board members. I will tell everyone that you are mentally unstable. I will tell them you tried to extort me for wedding money because you were jealous of my new family. I will drag your professional reputation through the mud so thoroughly that no accounting firm in this entire country will ever hire you again. You will be completely unemployable. You will end up starving on the streets." He stormed over to the door of his study and threw it wide open, pointing a furious, trembling finger toward the grand foyer. "Get out of my house," he roared, his voice echoing loudly through the empty halls. "You are officially banned from this property. You are banned from the rehearsal dinner. You are banned from the wedding. If you even try to show your face at that church, my private security will physically throw you out into the street where you belong. You are no longer my daughter." I walked calmly past him, my heels clicking sharply and methodically on the hardwood floor. I did not look back. He slammed the heavy mahogany door so hard the walls physically shook behind me. He truly believed his aggressive threats had worked. He thought he had successfully intimidated a weak, fragile girl into silent submission. He thought that by threatening my auditing career and banning me from his high society wedding, he had won the war and secured his stolen empire forever. But as I walked out into the crisp Chicago air, sliding into the driver's seat of my car, I touched the folded piece of personalized stationery resting safely in my jacket pocket. Thomas had absolutely no idea that his handwritten confession was not a piece of leverage to be negotiated. It was the absolute, undeniable death sentence I was about to hand directly to my lawyer, and it was going to burn his entire world to the ground. I left the heavy steel doors of the First National Bank of Chicago with my leather briefcase clutched tightly against my chest. Inside that bag was the absolute destruction of my father. The drive to his house in the affluent northern suburbs took 45 minutes, but it felt like an entire lifetime. With every single mile that passed, the naive, grieving daughter I used to be faded further into the rearview mirror. In her place sat a cold, calculating auditor who had just uncovered a multi-million-dollar fraud orchestrated by her own flesh and blood. I sat in my car outside my father's stolen estate for exactly 3 minutes. I did not shed a single tear. I did not call my best friend to vent. I did not scream or bang my hands against the steering wheel. The terrified, obedient daughter who had walked into that study was completely gone. In her place sat a senior financial auditor who had just been handed a very specific, highly complex puzzle. My father had thrown me out because he believed he had secured a $10 million safety net. He believed that marrying Cynthia would solve all of his cash flow problems. He was banking his entire future and his freedom on her late husband's vast estate. But in my line of work, we have a very simple rule: trust absolutely nothing and verify absolutely everything. I drove back to my cramped apartment, completely ignoring the fact that it was a Friday night. I brewed a massive pot of dark roast coffee, tied my hair back, and opened my laptop. I set up my dual monitors on my small kitchen table. If Thomas was willing to commit grand larceny and forge my mother's signature just to merge his stolen assets with Cynthia's fortune, I needed to know exactly what kind of fortune he was buying into. I needed to understand the exact financial architecture of his new high society bride. I started with the basics. I ran public property tax records in Cook County for the sprawling estate Cynthia supposedly owned. It was a massive piece of prime real estate in one of the most exclusive zip codes in Illinois. The society pages loved to photograph her standing in front of its grand columns, but the county clerk's digital portal told an entirely different story. The property taxes on Cynthia's grand estate were severely delinquent. We were not talking about a simple missed payment. She was nearly 3 years behind, owing tens of thousands of dollars in back taxes, and massive municipal penalties. Furthermore, there were multiple liens filed against the property by private contractors. Roofers, landscapers, and high-end interior designers had all taken legal action because they had not been paid in years. I leaned closer to my monitor, the blue light reflecting in the dark kitchen. The picture was starting to come into focus, but I needed more. I pulled the public probate records for Cynthia's late husband. Thomas had claimed the man left her millions. The probate documents revealed a very stark, very pathetic reality. The late husband had indeed been wealthy once, but his business had suffered massive losses right before his death. He had left Cynthia with a heavily mortgaged house, a mountain of corporate debt, and a lifestyle she absolutely could not afford to maintain on her own. The massive trust fund Thomas was drooling over simply did not exist. The millions he thought he was marrying into were nothing but thin air and aggressive credit card debt. I spent the next 4 hours deep diving into civil court dockets. I found multiple collection lawsuits filed against Cynthia by major credit card companies. She was actively being sued for hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid luxury purchases. Her platinum cards were completely maxed out and legally frozen. The custom designer wedding gown she was planning to wear, the expensive floral arrangements she had ordered for the cathedral, the lavish rehearsal dinner she was hosting. None of it was paid for. She was floating it all on the sheer promise that she was marrying a wealthy real estate investor. She was marrying Thomas to save herself from imminent catastrophic bankruptcy. The sheer absolute absurdity of the situation hit me so hard I actually had to push my chair back and laugh. The sound echoed in my empty apartment, loud and sharp and completely devoid of humor. My father, a man who had stolen his own daughter's inheritance to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle, was about to marry a woman who was faking her own massive wealth to secure a bailout. Thomas looked at Cynthia's grand house, her expensive jewelry, and her prominent social standing, and he saw a golden parachute. Cynthia looked at Thomas's custom suits, his premium country club memberships, and the endless stream of cash he threw around, cash that I had bled for in the freezing mountains of Japan, and she saw her ultimate savior. They were two desperate aging con artists trying to scam each other. It was a marriage built entirely on mutual parasitic fraud. I thought about Brad and Chloe, the two arrogant, deeply entitled adult children who had looked at me with such profound disgust on the steps of the cathedral. They had mocked my navy suit. They had treated me like a beggar looking for a handout. I ran a quick background check on both of them using standard corporate verification tools. It took me less than 20 minutes to completely dismantle their superiority complex. Brad was not a successful entrepreneur. His registered business, a luxury lifestyle brand he constantly boasted about on social media, had had its corporate status revoked by the state 2 years ago for failing to file basic tax returns. He had zero verifiable income. Chloe was equally pathetic. She had bounced from one unpaid fashion internship to another, currently facing eviction proceedings from her luxury downtown loft because she had not paid rent in 6 months. They were not high society heirs. They were grown unemployed adults waiting desperately for their mother to marry a rich man so they could continue to live their lazy, useless lives without ever having to work a single honest day. They were leeches, and Thomas was the host they had chosen to bleed dry. I sat back in my chair, sipping my lukewarm coffee as the sun began to rise over the Chicago skyline. The entire dynamic was clear. Thomas thought he was securing a $10 million fortune that would allow him to finally pay back the $4 million he had stolen from my mother's trust before I ever noticed it was gone. He believed that once the marriage certificate was signed, he would have access to Cynthia's accounts, wire me my inheritance, and quietly get away with the perfect crime. But Cynthia had no money to give him. If they actually made it down that aisle and merged their finances, Thomas would not find a safety net. He would find a massive suffocating sinkhole of debt. He would be legally tied to her bankruptcies, her unpaid property taxes, and her massive collection lawsuits. I could simply let them marry. I could let Thomas sign the papers, merge his stolen empire with her decaying one, and watch them both drown in their mutual deception. It would be a poetic sort of justice, but that was not enough. That was not the justice my mother deserved, and it certainly was not the justice I deserved after freezing in the Himalayas and sacrificing my youth for a lie. If I let them marry, Thomas would drag my mother's money down into Cynthia's black hole of debt. the $4 million that rightfully belonged to me would be seized by Cynthia's creditors the absolute second their assets were combined. I could not allow that to happen. I needed to protect my inheritance, and I needed to ensure that Thomas faced the absolute maximum amount of humiliation and legal ruin possible. I looked at the original will, the forged power of attorney, and Thomas's handwritten confession letter sitting on my kitchen counter. Then I looked at the massive stack of public records documenting Cynthia's impending financial collapse. A brilliant, devastating plan began to form in my mind. If I simply went to the police right now, Thomas would be arrested, but the story would remain a quiet, private family tragedy. He would hire a defense attorney, claim temporary insanity or financial stress, and try to negotiate a plea deal behind closed doors. He would never face the one thing he feared more than prison. He would never face public exposure. Thomas valued his reputation, his status in the country club, and his image as a wealthy patriarch above absolutely everything else. To truly punish a man who builds his entire life on appearances, you have to destroy him in front of his audience. Cynthia was the key. She was a woman driven entirely by financial survival. She did not love Thomas. She loved the illusion of his wealth. She was banking her entire social survival, her home, and her children's future on his bank accounts. If she found out that Thomas was not a millionaire real estate investor, but a broke, desperate criminal who was about to be indicted for grand larceny and wire fraud, she would not stand by her man. She would drop him instantly. She would run away as fast as her expensive designer heels could carry her, because marrying a convicted felon whose assets were frozen would mean her own immediate catastrophic ruin. My plan was simple, clinical, and utterly ruthless. I needed to formally secure my assets first. I needed a lawyer who specialized in high-stakes financial fraud to immediately file an emergency injunction to freeze the trust and all of Thomas's accounts. I needed the federal authorities to prepare the arrest warrants based on the forged power of attorney and the written confession. But the execution of that warrant, the moment the hammer actually fell, had to happen at the exact right time. It had to happen when Thomas was at his most confident, his most arrogant, and his most visible. It had to happen when Cynthia and all of their wealthy elite friends were standing right there to witness the complete collapse of his fake empire. I was not going to let him cancel the wedding. I was not going to let him quietly slip away in the middle of the night. I was going to let him put on his custom tuxedo. I was going to let Cynthia put on her unpaid designer gown. I was going to let Brad and Chloe stand at the altar dreaming of their unearned allowances. I was going to let Thomas walk right up to the very edge of his ultimate victory. And then right before God and everyone he was desperately trying to impress, I was going to take it all away. I gathered the printed court dockets, the property tax records, and the collection lawsuits against Cynthia, organizing them into a crisp professional presentation file. I placed it right next to the folder containing Thomas's criminal confession. Together, those two folders represented the complete destruction of two arrogant, greedy people who had made the massive mistake of underestimating an auditor. I checked the time. It was 8 in the morning on a Saturday. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Richard Hayes, a former federal prosecutor who was now the most ruthless financial crimes attorney in Chicago. I had worked with his firm on a massive corporate embezzlement case 2 years ago. He was brilliant, uncompromising, and he absolutely loved taking down arrogant men who thought they were above the law. I dialed his private number. He answered on the second ring. "Richard," I said, my voice completely clear and remarkably calm. "It is Clara. I need your help with a massive case of trust fraud forgery and grand larceny. I have a busy morning, Clara," he replied, his tone all business. "How big is the fraud and who is the target?" $4 million, I said, looking out my window at the morning traffic. "And the target is my own father. I have original wills, forged powers of attorney, and a signed handwritten confession. I also have his wedding date. We have exactly 30 days to freeze every single asset he claims to own and prepare the federal indictments." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the distinct sound of a man recognizing a perfect airtight case. "I will clear my afternoon schedule," Richard said. "Bring everything you have to my office in 1 hour. We are going to bury him." I hung up the phone. The terrified, abandoned 23-year-old girl was finally put to rest. The desperate freezing auditor in the Himalayas was gone. I was about to execute the most complex, satisfying audit of my entire career, and I was going to make absolutely certain that my father lost everything. I arrived at the towering glass and steel skyscraper in downtown Chicago precisely at 9 in the morning. Richard Hayes did not have a cozy or welcoming office. His law firm occupied the entire 52nd floor, a cold and imposing fortress of black marble and brushed steel. He was a man who made his living systematically dismantling the financial lives of corrupt corporate executives, embezzlers, and arrogant white-collar criminals. I had researched him extensively. He was notorious in the city for his absolute ruthlessness in the courtroom. He was exactly the kind of apex predator I needed to take down my father. I walked into his private corner conference room and laid the heavy manila folders on his vast mahogany desk. I did not cry. I did not ask for pity or sympathy. I simply sat down, folded my hands, and presented the cold, hard facts. I showed him my grandfather's original will, the forged power of attorney my father had used to hijack the $4 million trust, and the handwritten confession letter I had forced Thomas to sign just days prior on his expensive Persian rug. Hayes put on his reading glasses and scrutinized the documents in absolute heavy silence for 20 long minutes. The only sound in the room was the steady ticking of a heavy grandfather clock in the corner and the faint sound of city traffic far below. Finally, he took his glasses off and looked directly at me. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and completely devoid of any sentimental warmth. He told me it was one of the most brazen, incredibly foolish cases of grand larceny and trust fraud he had seen in his 30-year career. He pointed to the forged signature and noted that Thomas had left a paper trail so incredibly wide and obvious that a first-year law student could follow it. My father had simply relied on emotional manipulation, assuming that because he had wrapped his theft in family trauma and a fake medical bankruptcy, his obedient daughter would never dare to look behind the curtain. Hayes leaned forward across the desk and promised me we were not just going to sue him for the money. He explained that beyond civil recovery, we were triggering a massive federal criminal investigation. Wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. The federal authorities would inevitably become involved. Thomas was not just looking at bankruptcy. He was looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary. For the next 3 weeks, I took a formal leave of absence from my auditing firm and practically lived in Hayes' conference room. We did not make a single public fuss. We did not send any angry emails or legal threat letters. We completely ignored the furious escalating voicemails Thomas left on my phone, demanding my continued silence. Instead, we operated in absolute terrifying secrecy. I used every single ounce of my professional auditing training to tear apart the financial architecture of my father's stolen life. Working alongside Hayes' team of forensic accountants, we subpoenaed bank records through quiet, expedited legal channels. We traced the exact flow of the $4 million from my grandfather's trust directly into a series of shell accounts Thomas had set up to mimic a legitimate, self-made real estate investment portfolio. The sheer audacity of his reckless spending was absolutely staggering to document. I found a charge for a $14,000 first-class ticket to Paris for Cynthia booked on the exact day I was hospitalized for severe altitude sickness in the Himalayas. I found a $50,000 deposit for the lavish cathedral wedding venue, paid out of the exact same account where my Japanese hazard pay was consistently deposited. But what hurt the most, what truly turned my heart to absolute ice, was seeing my own literal survival money mixed into his fraudulent ledger. I sat at a massive conference table, surrounded by empty coffee cups and thousands of pages of financial transcripts, matching the dates I had frozen in a tent to the exact dates Thomas had purchased a premium country club membership. I matched the exact amounts of money I had wired him to save him from his fabricated bankruptcy to the exact amounts he had spent on luxury vacations for Cynthia's lazy, entitled children. My blood, my sweat, and my terrifying nights in the freezing cold had directly financed their arrogance. Every single time I felt a twinge of lingering daughterly guilt, I forced myself to look at those numbers. Numbers never lie. They do not manipulate you. They do not play the victim. They simply show the undeniable truth. And the truth was that my father was a parasitic criminal who had financially enslaved me to buy a fake aristocratic life. We needed to hit him where it would cause the maximum amount of devastation, and we needed to do it before he could legally merge his stolen empire with Cynthia's mountain of hidden debt. If they managed to sign a marriage certificate, disentangling my stolen inheritance from her massive credit card bankruptcies would take years of agonizing, expensive litigation. We had to strike first, and we had to strike hard. Hayes explained our aggressive strategy. We were going to file for an ex parte emergency injunction in federal court. It is a highly aggressive legal maneuver typically used in high-stakes financial fraud cases. By filing ex parte, we were petitioning the judge without notifying the defendant. This prevents the criminal from realizing they are under investigation, ensuring they cannot panic, liquidate their remaining assets, and flee the country. We were going to completely blindside him. 2 days before the extravagant wedding at St. Patrick's Cathedral, Hayes and I sat in a sterile, imposing federal courtroom. The room smelled of old wood and floor wax, the air heavy with solemn authority. We presented our mountain of irrefutable evidence directly to a federal judge. We showed the forged signatures, the fraudulent bank transfers, the detailed forensic accounting reports, and Thomas's own handwritten confession admitting to the entire multi-million-dollar scheme. The judge, an older, stern-looking man who had absolutely no patience for white-collar criminals exploiting their own families, read through the handwritten confession twice. The silence in the courtroom was incredibly tense. He looked over the massive wooden bench at me, his strict expression softening for just a fraction of a second, acknowledging the sheer betrayal I had endured. Then his face hardened back into absolute judicial resolve. Without asking a single additional question, he picked up his pen and signed the emergency order. With that single stroke of black ink, the judge authorized the immediate freezing of every single bank account, investment portfolio, and line of credit bearing my father's name. He ordered the immediate confiscation and freezing of the $4 million trust, legally securing my inheritance from any further theft. The execution of the federal order was timed with absolute flawless precision. The major banks and credit institutions would receive the legal notices and lock down the accounts exactly 24 hours before the wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin. The trap was now fully armed and legally binding. At exactly 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, 24 hours before the wedding, the federal wire hit the banking institutions. I sat in Hayes' office and watched the confirmation emails roll in. The main commercial bank frozen. The secondary investment accounts frozen. The offshore shell accounts completely locked down. The legal siege was absolute. While I was sitting in a high-rise office, securing his absolute legal and financial destruction, Thomas was living in a state of pure, blissful, arrogant ignorance. Through mutual acquaintances in the city and the relentless, boastful social media posts from Cynthia's obnoxious children, I knew exactly what my father was doing. He was incredibly busy trying on his custom-tailored tuxedo, sipping expensive imported champagne, and finalizing the lavish details of his fake high society wedding. He was completely focused on the visual aesthetic of his ultimate triumph. Chloe had just posted a video from a luxury bridal boutique swirling in a $6,000 bridesmaid dress, tagging my father with the caption boasting about her new billionaire lifestyle. Brad posted a photo of the fleet of rented vintage cars that were supposed to carry the bridal party to the reception. Thomas had even hired a private security team to stand at the church doors, specifically instructed to physically remove me if I dared to show my face and ruin his perfect day. He genuinely believed he had won the war. He believed that his aggressive threats in his study had successfully terrified his weak, obedient daughter into permanent submission. He was likely looking at his reflection in a tall mirror at that very moment, adjusting his expensive silk tie, thinking he was the smartest, most untouchable man in all of Chicago. He had absolutely no idea that a federal judge had just turned his platinum credit cards into completely useless pieces of plastic. He had no idea that the massive bank accounts he planned to show off to his new bride and her elite social circle were currently locked down tighter than a maximum security federal prison. He was happily planning a $250,000 wedding reception, completely blind to the fact that he could not even afford to buy a single cup of coffee. His entire glittering universe was built over a massive sinkhole, and the ground was already giving way beneath his expensive leather shoes. The legal siege was locked completely into place. All I had to do now was wait for the sun to rise on his wedding day, walk up to those massive oak doors at the cathedral, and watch his entire fake life burn to the ground. Friday evening descended on Chicago with a bitter chill, but inside the private dining room of the exclusive Astor Hotel, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and aggressively opulent. It was 7 o'clock at night. Exactly 5 hours earlier, the federal wire had hit the banking networks. I knew for an absolute fact that every single account bearing my father's name was currently locked in a deep, impenetrable freeze. Yet here he was hosting a lavish rehearsal dinner for 60 of Chicago's most elite socialites, completely oblivious to the fact that he was effectively a bankrupt man standing in a rented tuxedo. I walked through the grand lobby of the hotel, my heels sinking slightly into the thick plush carpet. I was not wearing an extravagant designer gown. I wore a sharp-tailored charcoal gray suit. It was the exact suit I wore when I delivered devastating audit results to hostile corporate boards. I felt absolutely no fear. The trembling, heartbroken girl who had been banished to the front porch 15 years ago was entirely gone. The desperate daughter who had endured frostbite in the Himalayas to save her father from a fake medical debt no longer existed. I was a senior financial auditor, and I was stepping into the room to perform a visual inspection of a fraudulent enterprise. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the private banquet hall and stepped inside. The sheer grotesque display of stolen wealth hit me like a physical wave. There were towering ice sculptures perfectly carved into elegant swans. There were massive floral centerpieces of imported white orchids on every single dining table. Waiters in pristine white gloves circulated smoothly with silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and crystal glasses of vintage champagne. I looked at the extravagant spread, and my professional mind instantly converted the visual luxury into raw numbers. I knew exactly how many punishing hours I had worked in the thin, freezing mountain air to pay for those imported orchids. I knew exactly how much of my stolen inheritance was currently being poured into those crystal champagne flutes. At the far end of the room, standing directly beneath a massive crystal chandelier, was Thomas. He was holding court. He had a glass of expensive premium bourbon in one hand, laughing loudly at a joke told by a wealthy city alderman. Cynthia was clinging tightly to his other arm, wearing a pure silk evening gown and dripping in heavy diamonds that I knew she had charged to a maxed-out credit card. They looked like royalty. They looked entirely invincible. I stood perfectly still, just inside the doorway, waiting for the inevitable shift in the room's gravity. I did not have to wait long. A waiter dropped a silver serving tongue with a loud ringing clatter. The sharp noise caused Thomas to turn his head toward the entrance. His booming, arrogant laugh died instantly in his throat. The rapid transformation in his face was absolutely spectacular to witness. All the healthy color rapidly drained from his tanned, perfectly groomed face, leaving him looking like a sick gray ghost. His eyes widened in sheer unadulterated panic. His jaw actually dropped open. Just 3 days ago, he had screamed at me in his private study, threatened to thoroughly destroy my career, and legally banned me from stepping foot near his wedding. He genuinely believed he had terrified me into permanent submission. Seeing me standing there, calm, collected, and completely unafraid, shattered his entire reality. Cynthia felt his posture stiffen violently. She turned her head, following his terrified gaze right to the doorway. When she saw me, her fake aristocratic smile collapsed into a vicious, ugly sneer. I could see her perfectly manicured fingers digging sharply into the expensive fabric of my father's jacket. Thomas handed his bourbon to a passing waiter with a shaking hand. He whispered something urgent to Cynthia, then began marching across the crowded banquet room directly toward me. He moved with aggressive, heavy strides, trying to mask his rising panic with an aura of stern paternal authority. But I could see the cold sweat forming on his brow. I could see the slight, betraying tremor in his hands. "What in the name of God are you doing here?" he hissed, stopping exactly 2 feet away from me. His voice was a tight, desperate whisper, frantically trying to keep the wealthy guests from overhearing. "I told you that you were completely banned from this property. I told you that if you showed your face here, I would have you thrown out into the street." I looked at him with a perfectly serene, utterly cold expression. "I am just here to offer a pre-wedding toast." "Thomas," I replied, making sure my voice was completely steady and loud enough for the couple standing at the nearest table to clearly hear. "After everything I have paid for, I figured I deserved at least a single glass of your expensive champagne." His eyes darted frantically around the room, noting the curious, judging glances from his high society friends. The absolute last thing he wanted was a messy public scene. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his grip tight and punishing. "You are leaving right now," he demanded, trying to forcefully pull me back toward the heavy brass doors. I did not pull away. I simply looked down at his hand gripping my tailored sleeve, and then I looked back up into his desperate, panicked eyes. "Remove your hand from me right now, or I will scream so loudly that every single person in this luxury hotel will know exactly what you did to my mother's will." Thomas released my arm instantly, as if the charcoal fabric of my suit had suddenly caught fire. He took a stumbling step backward, his chest heaving with trapped, impotent rage. Before he could attempt another desperate threat, the heavy, suffocating scent of overpowering floral perfume washed over us. Cynthia had abandoned her elite guests and marched over, flanked immediately by her two parasitic children, Brad and Chloe. They formed a tight, aggressive wall of fake wealth right in front of me, effectively blocking me from the rest of the party. Well, Brad said loudly. His voice completely lacked the desperate, hushed panic of my father. Brad wanted an audience. He wanted a dramatic show. He was wearing an obnoxious velvet dinner jacket and holding a fresh glass of champagne. Look who decided to drag herself out of the slums just to ruin our private family dinner. Chloe crossed her arms, her lips curled in utter disgust. She looked me up and down, openly mocking my tailored charcoal suit. "Are you seriously wearing a cheap, depressing office uniform to an elite rehearsal dinner? You look like a miserable tax collector who got lost on the way back to her cubicle. It is absolutely pathetic. Did you really think they were going to let you sit at our table dressed like a common laborer?" Cynthia let out a sharp, condescending laugh that grated against my ears. "I suppose we should not expect anything more from someone of your low background, Clara. Your father told me how deeply troubled you are. He told me how you always struggled to fit in with sophisticated society. But showing up completely uninvited to a highly exclusive private event is just a new level of absolute desperation." I stood perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not defend my clothing, and I certainly did not defend my profession. I just let them talk. I let them dig their graves as deep as they possibly could. The louder they got, the more the surrounding guests stopped their polite chatter to listen. The string quartet in the corner seemed to play a little softer as the tension in the room rapidly escalated into a suffocating, heavy silence. "You know exactly why she's here," Mother Brad announced, his voice echoing across the quiet banquet hall. He took a step toward me, puffing out his chest with unearned, ridiculous arrogance. "She is just a jealous, bitter little number cruncher. She spent her whole life being an absolute nobody, and now she sees Thomas marrying into real established money. She smells the cash." Chloe giggled, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "It is so incredibly embarrassing. She is acting like a desperate prodigal child crawling back to beg for a handout now that she realizes how rich we actually are. What is the matter, Clara? Did you max out your little credit cards? Did you come here to beg Thomas for some of our spare change so you can pay your rent this month?" The sheer absolute irony of her words was a magnificent masterpiece. Chloe, a woman currently facing a brutal eviction for 6 months of unpaid rent, was accusing me of begging. Brad, a man whose fake luxury lifestyle brand had been completely dissolved by the state for tax evasion, was calling me a nobody looking for a handout. Cynthia, a widow drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of aggressive credit card collection lawsuits, was standing there pretending to be an aristocratic billionaire. And Thomas, the criminal who had stolen $4 million from his own flesh and blood just to buy his way into this room, was standing completely silent, watching his fake family humiliate his real daughter. I looked around the room. I saw the wealthy politicians, the corporate executives, and the country club elite whispering behind their hands. I saw the pitying, thoroughly disgusted looks they were casting in my direction. They fully believed Brad and Chloe's loud, toxic narrative. They saw a bitter, poor, discarded daughter trying to ruin a beautiful wedding out of sheer financial jealousy. Any normal person would have broken down entirely. Any normal person would have screamed, cried, or desperately tried to explain the truth, right then and there to clear their name and protect their pride. But I am an auditor. I know that the most powerful weapon in any confrontation is absolute, unwavering emotional control. When the opposing party is loud, frantic, and aggressive, you simply let them burn through their own oxygen. I did not break. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice, to defend myself against their pathetic, desperate lies. Instead, I smiled. It was not a weak, defensive smile. It was a slow, terrifying, deeply confident smile that reached all the way to my eyes. It was the smile of a woman who was currently holding the absolute destruction of every single person standing in front of her. I looked at the massive, glistening ice sculptures. I looked at the imported white orchids sitting on the pristine tablecloths. I looked at the crystal champagne flutes filled with expensive vintage wine. I knew with absolute factual certainty that the federal freeze order had locked down Thomas's accounts exactly 5 hours ago. I knew that when the hotel management eventually ran the final credit card authorization to close out this wildly extravagant rehearsal dinner, the card would inevitably decline. Every single thing in this room was currently unpaid for. They were standing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, loudly mocking the only person who actually owned a life jacket. My calm, unrelenting smile deeply unnerved them. Brad's arrogant smirk faltered slightly. Chloe shifted uncomfortably on her expensive heels, glancing at her mother for reassurance. Thomas looked like he was about to pass out from sheer panic. He knew me. He knew I was not a woman who smiled when she was losing. Are you seriously just going to stand there and smile like a total psychopath? Brad demanded, his voice pitching higher with sudden, inexplicable insecurity. I am going to call the private security guards right now. We are not going to let a begging, miserable prodigal child ruin the aesthetic of our beautiful family celebration. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. The entire group flinched backward instinctively, their fake bravery cracking under the weight of my silent confidence. I kept my voice perfectly calm, smooth, and laced with absolute terrifying authority. I am not here to ask for a single dime from any of you, I said, making sure every syllable landed clearly in the suffocating silence of the banquet hall. I am simply here to enjoy the spectacular view. Please do not let me interrupt your incredibly expensive evening. Eat the caviar, drink the imported champagne, celebrate your massive, magnificent fortunes. I highly recommend you enjoy every single bite of this meal because it is going to be a very, very long time before any of you can afford to eat like this again. I held my ground, my smile never wavering, letting my words hang in the heavy, perfumed air. I watched the profound confusion wash over Cynthia, Brad, and Chloe. They did not understand what I meant, but they could hear the absolute terrifying certainty in my voice. Thomas, however, understood instantly. The sheer terror pooling in his eyes confirmed it. He knew the audit was coming. He just did not know that the final ledger had already been closed. I stood there, in the center of their fake elite world, absorbing their toxic mockery, letting them completely gorge themselves on their own arrogance, waiting perfectly still for the final trap to snap shut. I stood in the absolute center of that opulent banquet room, letting my final words hang in the heavy, perfumed air. The silence in the luxury hall was profound and absolute. Thomas realized in that exact second that he had completely lost control of the narrative inside that room. He could not afford to let me speak another sentence in front of his wealthy guests and his fake elite new family. He knew that one more sentence from me could expose the massive financial sinkhole he was desperately trying to hide. He moved with sudden, violent urgency. He grabbed my elbow, his grip incredibly tight and punishing, digging his manicured fingers deep into the fabric of my charcoal suit. He did not say a single word to Cynthia or her arrogant children. He just pulled me roughly toward the heavy wooden doors leading to the service hallway at the back of the restaurant. I let him guide me. I did not resist. I wanted to see exactly how far his desperate panic would take him. We moved past the bewildered waitstaff and pushed aggressively through the swinging metal doors into the harsh fluorescent lights of the kitchen corridor. The beautiful sounds of the string quartet and the gentle clinking of crystal glasses faded instantly, replaced by the loud clatter of industrial dishwashers and shouting chefs. He marched me past them, pushing open the heavy steel exit door and shoving me forcefully out into the freezing Chicago night. The contrast was physically jarring. We went from a world of warm imported orchids and vintage champagne to a dark, damp, freezing alleyway that smelled strongly of wet asphalt and rotting garbage. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind us, cutting off all the warmth and light from the banquet hall. We were completely alone in the shadows. The cold winter wind whipped down the narrow brick alley, cutting right through my thin suit jacket. But I did not shiver. I stood my ground and looked at the man who had thrown me out onto a different cold porch 15 years ago. Thomas let go of my arm and began pacing furiously back and forth across the wet, grimy pavement. The dim, flickering light from a single yellow street lamp above cast long, distorted, monstrous shadows across his face. He looked exactly like a cornered animal. All of his refined country club elegance had completely evaporated in the span of 3 short minutes. His breathing was incredibly heavy and ragged, forming thick white clouds in the freezing air. He stopped pacing and turned to me, his chest heaving with uncontrolled toxic rage. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Clara?" He snarled, his voice completely stripped of any remaining pretense of fatherly affection. "You think you can just march into my private event, insult my future wife, disrespect her children, and threaten my entire livelihood without facing massive catastrophic consequences? You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with right now." He took a slow, highly aggressive step toward me, towering over me, just like he did when I was a terrified 13-year-old girl holding 2 black garbage bags. But the psychological dynamic had completely and permanently shifted. I did not lower my eyes. I did not shrink back against the cold, damp brick wall behind me. I met his furious, burning gaze with the calm, calculating precision of a senior financial auditor inspecting a fraudulent, decaying ledger. "I know exactly who I am dealing with, Thomas," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and clear in the freezing wind. "I am dealing with a cowardly, desperate thief who brought a fake notary into a hospital room and forged his dying wife's signature just to steal a $4 million trust from his own biological daughter. I am dealing with a pathetic holocon artist who used my hazardous overseas auditing pay to buy expensive tailored suits and luxury caviar dinners for a fake aristocratic widow who is secretly drowning in credit card debt. I am dealing with a criminal who is currently standing on a crumbling mountain of absolute lies." Thomas clenched his fists so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white in the dim yellow light. "You listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful, miserable little wretch," he threatened, stepping even closer until I could smell the sharp, expensive premium bourbon on his breath. "I'm drawing a hard, permanent line in the sand right now. You are absolutely forbidden from coming anywhere near St. Patrick's Cathedral tomorrow afternoon. I have hired an elite private security detail for the entire venue. I gave the head of security your photograph this morning. They have explicit, uncompromising orders to intercept you at the perimeter. If you even attempt to set foot on those church steps, they will physically drag you away and have you immediately arrested for criminal trespassing. You will spend my entire wedding day sitting in a cold, filthy jail cell while I marry into a $10 million fortune. You cannot stop this wedding, Clara. You have already lost." He paused, panting heavily, clearly waiting to see the terror finally register on my face. He desperately wanted to see the fragile, obedient girl he had broken and discarded 15 years ago. He wanted me to break down, cry, and beg for a tiny scrap of his approval or his mercy. When my expression remained completely unchanged, a cold mask of absolute indifference, his aggressive posture faltered slightly. The sheer, suffocating panic began to bleed back into his eyes. He realized his brutal threats were bouncing off me like rain off solid concrete. His voice abruptly shifted from a furious, commanding roar to a desperate, calculating demand. "Give me the letter, Clara," he ordered, holding out his right hand, his palm facing up toward the sky. "Give me the handwritten confession right now. I know you brought it with you. You walked into that banquet room trying to use it as leverage to extort me. You wanted to make a massive public scene and force me to buy your silence. Fine. You win this round. Just hand over the paper. Walk away from this dirty alley and I will wire you $100,000 first thing Monday morning. That is more money than you make in an entire year crunching numbers in a miserable corporate cubicle. Take the money, go back to your pathetic, lonely life, and never speak to me or my new family ever again." He genuinely believed that was how the entire world worked. He truly believed that every single person on this earth was just as morally bankrupt and profoundly greedy as he was. He thought the written confession of his massive multi-million-dollar felony crimes was simply a bargaining chip, a fragile piece of paper to be bought and sold in the shadows of a dirty alleyway behind an expensive hotel. He thought he could just easily buy his way out of a long sentence in federal prison using the exact same stolen funds he had hijacked from my mother's sacred trust. I looked down at his outstretched hand, shaking slightly in the freezing Chicago wind. I looked at the desperate, pathetic, crawling pleading in his eyes. He was begging a daughter he had discarded like human garbage to save him from the catastrophic consequences of his own monstrous greed. I reached my right hand into the inner breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit. I felt the crisp, folded piece of paper waiting there in the dark. Thomas saw the movement and his eyes lit up with a sickening, victorious greed. He truly thought he had broken me. He thought the promise of a quiet, lucrative payoff had successfully secured his safety and permanently guaranteed his lavish, fake aristocratic future. I pulled the folded paper out of my pocket and held it loosely between my index and middle fingers. Without saying a single word, I placed it directly into his waiting palm. Thomas snatched the paper eagerly, his fingers fumbling in his desperate, pathetic haste. He backed away slightly, moving closer to the center of the alley, holding the document up toward the dim, flickering yellow light of the street lamp to verify its contents. He unfolded it rapidly, his eyes eagerly scanning the lines of text. I watched his face very, very closely. I watched the initial surge of profound, overwhelming relief wash over his features as he recognized his own handwriting. He saw the paragraphs detailing the forged power of attorney, the hidden safe deposit box, and the calculated theft of the $4 million trust. He let out a loud, shuddering breath, a deep, guttural sound of absolute triumphant victory. But his glorious victory lasted for exactly 3 seconds. As he stared at the paper under the harsh yellow light, his eyes snagged on something. He rubbed the surface of the paper with his thumb. The expensive, heavy textured feel of his personalized study stationery was completely missing. The dark blue ink did not have the slight natural indentations of a freshly written document pressed hard by a terrified hand. It was entirely flat. It was completely uniform. It was perfectly, cleanly reproduced on a standard, incredibly cheap piece of commercial copy paper. Thomas froze completely. The healthy color drained from his face for the second time that night, leaving him looking like a decaying corpse standing in a custom-tailored tuxedo. His eyes snapped up from the paper and locked fiercely onto my face. "This is a photocopy," he whispered, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated horror. He shook the piece of paper at me, his hand trembling violently in the freezing wind. "Where is the original letter, Clara? Where is the real confession?" I smiled. It was the exact same slow, terrifying, deeply confident smile I had given him inside the opulent banquet hall just 10 minutes prior. It was the smile of an auditor who had already firmly closed the ledger, sealed the evidence, and securely locked the vault. "Do you honestly think I am stupid enough to walk into a dark, isolated alley with a desperate, cornered criminal while carrying the only piece of original physical evidence that proves his massive financial crimes?" I asked softly, taking one slow, deliberate step closer to him. "You taught me a very valuable, painful lesson 15 years ago, Thomas. You taught me to never, ever trust you. Ever. You taught me to fiercely protect myself because my own father absolutely would not lift a finger to save me." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing rapidly, like a suffocating fish pulled completely out of the water. He looked down at the absolutely worthless photocopy trembling in his hand, and then looked back up at my face. The sheer, terrifying reality of his situation was finally crashing down on his mind with the devastating force of a massive winter avalanche. "Where is it?" he pleaded, his voice rising to a frantic, high-pitched whine that echoed pathetically off the wet brick walls. "Clara, please, I am begging you, tell me where the original letter is." I kept my voice perfectly level, delivering the final catastrophic blow before the storm. "The original handwritten confession is currently sitting in a highly secure fireproof safe inside the downtown office of Richard Hayes, the most ruthless, unforgiving financial crimes attorney in the entire city of Chicago. It is sitting right next to the certified court, stamped copies of my mother's real will, the forged power of attorney you signed on her deathbed, and the comprehensive, deeply detailed forensic accounting report tracking every single dollar you stole from my trust fund to finance your pathetic fake life." Thomas let out a low, agonizing groan that sounded barely human. He stumbled backward blindly, his shoulder hitting the wet, freezing brick wall of the alley. He slid down slightly as his legs completely lost their strength, his custom suit soaking up the dirty water from the pavement. "The federal authorities already have absolutely everything they need." I continued, showing absolutely no mercy to the broken, whimpering man groveling against the brick wall. "They have the fraudulent bank documents. They have the precise financial tracing. They know all about the hidden offshore shell accounts you used to hide my money. I am not here to negotiate a dirty payoff in an alley. Thomas, I am here to perform a final visual inspection of a completely collapsing enterprise. You can hire all the elite private security guards you want for St. Patrick's Cathedral tomorrow afternoon. You can tell them to violently block the heavy oak doors. You can tell them to drag me away and throw me out into the street. It does not matter in the slightest. The trap is already closed permanently, and you are locked firmly inside. I turned my back on him. I did not wait for his desperate response. I did not need to hear his pathetic weeping, his empty promises, or his frantic, useless negotiations. I walked away down the freezing, damp alleyway, my heels clicking sharply and methodically against the wet pavement. I left him completely alone in the dark with his worthless, copied piece of paper and the terrifying reality of his impending destruction. The extreme suffocating panic had fully overwhelmed his mind, paralyzing him entirely. I had successfully set the perfect, inescapable stage for the final act, and tomorrow afternoon at the altar, the entire world was going to watch his glittering empire burn. The cold autumn wind whipped across the stone steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral, perfectly matching the absolute ice in my father's eyes. We were back to the exact moment the trap was fully set. He stood there, in his custom tuxedo, his arms spread wide to block the massive oak doors, surrounded by hundreds of Chicago's most elite socialites. He looked down at me with pure, unadulterated contempt and delivered the words he thought would finally break me. "You are not invited. Go home." Cynthia sneered behind him, her heavy diamond necklace catching the afternoon sunlight. Her two parasitic children, Brad and Chloe, smirked with unearned arrogance, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my public humiliation. They were looking at me like I was a desperate beggar who had crawled out of the gutters to ruin their spectacular high society coronation. Thomas genuinely believed that his brutal threats from the dark alley the night before had worked. He thought I was standing there, empty-handed, utterly defeated, and ready to turn around and cry my way back to a miserable, impoverished life. He was absolutely catastrophically wrong. I did not turn around. I did not lower my head in shame. Instead, I took one very slow, highly deliberate step forward, moving past his outstretched arm and stepping up onto the highest stone platform of the cathedral entrance. I was now standing above him, facing the massive crowd of wealthy guests who were actively filing up the stairs to witness the wedding of the year. I could see the local politicians, the corporate executives, and the country club elite pausing on the steps, their expensive leather shoes halting on the stone as they sensed the heavy, suffocating tension radiating from the doorway. I reached my right hand deep into my structured leather briefcase. I did not pull out a cheap flat photocopy like the one I had handed Thomas in the freezing alley behind the rehearsal dinner. My fingers closed around the thick, heavy, textured stationery of his personalized study notepad. I pulled the original handwritten confession letter out into the bright autumn sunlight. Thomas saw the heavy cream paper. He saw the distinct embossed gold monogram of his own initials at the top. The sudden, violent realization that I had brought the real physical evidence to his perfect wedding hit him with the devastating force of a speeding train. The smug, arrogant mask he had worn for 15 years began to instantly dissolve. The healthy, confident color rapidly drained from his meticulously groomed face, leaving him looking like a terrified, cornered animal. He opened his mouth to shout, to call for his expensive private security guards to do absolutely anything to stop the impending audit of his life. But I was significantly faster, and I was completely merciless. I did not scream. I did not cry. I used the exact same clear, authoritative, projecting voice I used when presenting catastrophic financial discrepancies to hostile corporate boards. I raised the letter and read his own handwritten words aloud, making absolutely certain that my voice echoed sharply off the stone columns and carried directly into the massive crowd of waiting guests. "I apologize for stealing $4 million from your mother's trust fund." I read each word landing like a physical blow in the crisp air. "I confess that I brought a fake notary into her hospital room as she was dying. I confess that I explicitly forged her signature on a fraudulent power of attorney document to illegally gain access to the inheritance she legally left to you." The effect was instantaneous and absolutely spectacular. It was a perfect, devastating domino effect. The live string quartet playing softly in the vestibule abruptly stopped, a harsh screech of a violin bow cutting through the sudden silence. The polite, cultured murmurs of the elite wedding guests died instantly in their throats. Over 300 people stood completely frozen on the cathedral steps, their eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated shock. You could have heard a pin drop on the cold stone. I did not stop reading. I kept my eyes locked on the paper, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. I confessed that I hid her original will in a safe deposit box to conceal the truth. I confess that the wealth I have displayed, the country club memberships, the luxury vacations, and this very wedding were all financed by the money I systematically stole from my own biological daughter while forcing her to believe we were completely bankrupt. Loud, horrified gasp ripped through the crowd of guests. Wealthy men in tailored suits exchanged alarmed, disgusted glances. Women in expensive silk dresses covered their mouths in absolute disbelief. The carefully constructed, flawless reputation Thomas had spent the last 5 years buying with my stolen money was burning to the ground in a matter of seconds. Everyone he had ever tried to impress was currently listening to a detailed, undeniable confession of his massive federal crimes. Thomas lunged forward, his hands grasping desperately at the air, his face contorted in a mask of pure terror. "Shut up! Up!" He screamed, his voice cracking wildly. "Shut up right now. It is a lie. She is lying. She is a crazy, bitter, jealous girl making up insane stories. Somebody get the security guards out here immediately." But the security guards did not move. They were standing at the bottom of the steps, looking just as shocked and paralyzed as the rest of the wealthy guests. Nobody was going to touch me. The sheer overwhelming detail of the confession had completely paralyzed the entire cathedral. Then Cynthia moved. The fake aristocratic widow, the woman who had planned to use Thomas as her ultimate golden parachute to escape her own crushing credit card bankruptcies, realized that her perfect millionaire savior was actually a desperate, broke criminal. The immense glittering illusion of her new luxurious life was evaporating right before her eyes. If Thomas had stolen $4 million and forged legal documents, he had no money to save her. He was not a real estate mogul. He was a massive liability about to be indicted by the federal government. Cynthia pushed violently past Thomas. Her heavy, unpaid designer wedding gown rustled loudly against the stone. Her face was chalk white, her eyes wide with a manic, terrifying panic. She marched directly up to me and snatched the heavy cream stationery right out of my hands. I let her take it. I wanted her to read the physical proof with her own 2 eyes. I wanted her to see the exact signature of the man she thought was going to rescue her from her massive debts. Cynthia stared down at the paper. Her hands were shaking so violently that the expensive stationery rattled loudly in the quiet air. She read the detailed paragraphs. She saw the exact dates, the exact amounts, and the undeniable, perfectly matched signature of Thomas at the very bottom of the page. The reality of her catastrophic situation crashed down on her mind. If she married this man today, her finances would be permanently tied to a convicted felon whose accounts were entirely frozen by a federal judge. Brad and Chloe crowded in behind their mother, looking over her shoulder at the handwritten confession. Brad's arrogant, mocking smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, nauseating terror. Chloe covered her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the crowd of judging socialites, realizing that her entire fake high society life was over before it even officially began. "This is real," Cynthia whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of absolute horror and rising vicious fury. She looked up slowly, turning her piercing, venomous gaze away from me and directing it entirely onto Thomas. "This is your handwriting, Thomas. You forged a legal document. You stole $4 million from your own dying wife." "Cynthia, please, darling, you have to listen to me," Thomas begged, holding his hands up in a pathetic, groveling gesture. He was physically backing away from her, terrified of the massive explosion he knew was coming. "She forced me to write that. She threatened me in my study. It is completely out of context. I have investments. I have plenty of capital. We are going to be incredibly wealthy together. You just have to walk down the aisle with me. We can fix all of this after the ceremony." "Do not ever speak to me again, you pathetic, broke liar," Cynthia screamed, her voice echoing violently across the cathedral steps. Her carefully maintained, polite upper-class mask shattered into a million jagged pieces. "You told me you were a multi-millionaire. You told me you were going to pay off the mortgages on my estate. You are nothing but a common, disgusting thief. You are completely bankrupt." The guests surrounding the entrance actually began to physically back away from Thomas, treating him like he was highly contagious. The men he had played golf with, the local politicians, he had bought drinks for the elite socialites, he had desperately courted for years. They were all staring at him with absolute unmasked revulsion. In the high society circles of suburban Chicago, there is absolutely nothing worse than a man who fakes his wealth and steals from his own family. Thomas was instantly, permanently excommunicated from the only world he actually cared about. He looked around at the hundreds of disgusted faces, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He was completely trapped. He had no leverage left. He had no fake money to hide behind. His custom tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap borrowed costume. He looked back at me, his eyes filled with a dark, toxic hatred, but beneath the anger, there was the undeniable, suffocating realization that he had completely underestimated the daughter he threw away. "You planned this," he hissed at me, his voice trembling with defeated rage. "You waited until my entire social circle was here, just to humiliate me. You destroyed my entire life over a piece of paper." I stood tall on the cathedral steps, looking down at the man who had stolen my youth and my inheritance. "I did not destroy your life, Thomas," I said calmly, my voice ringing with the absolute certainty of justice. "You destroyed it yourself the absolute second you brought a fake notary into my mother's hospital room. I am just the auditor who finally decided to balance the ledger." Cynthia did not wait for another word. She reached up with a violently shaking hand, unclasped the heavy, expensive diamond necklace from around her throat, and threw it aggressively at Thomas's chest. It hit him with a sharp clatter and fell to the cold stone floor, scattering brilliant sparks of light. "The wedding is completely cancelled," Cynthia announced to the massive crowd, her voice shaking with rage and public humiliation. "Everyone go home. There is absolutely nothing to celebrate here today." She turned on her expensive heels, grabbed the heavy fabric of her designer gown, and began marching rapidly down the stone steps toward the parking lot, desperate to escape the disastrous public spectacle. Brad and Chloe immediately followed her, rushing away from the church doors, like they were fleeing a burning building, completely abandoning the man who was supposed to be their new, wealthy father. The domino effect was absolute and irreversible. Thomas stood completely alone at the top of the cathedral steps. His bride was gone. His fake aristocratic family had abandoned him. His wealthy friends were turning their backs in sheer disgust, rapidly heading toward their luxury cars to escape the massive scandal. The beautiful floral arrangements inside the church suddenly looked like decorations for a funeral. The entire glittering empire he had built on stolen money and calculated lies had completely disintegrated into ash right in front of his eyes. I watched him slowly sink down onto the cold stone steps, burying his face in his hands, as the full devastating weight of his reality finally crushed him. He had absolutely no money left. His accounts were legally frozen by a federal judge. He had no reputation left in the city, and very soon the authorities would be arriving to address the handwritten confession of massive financial fraud that was currently resting in Cynthia's discarded grasp. I did not feel sorry for him. I felt an incredible, profound sense of absolute peace. The heavy, suffocating burden I had carried for 15 years was permanently gone. I turned around, picked up my leather briefcase, and began walking slowly down the cathedral steps. I did not look back at the broken man crying in his expensive tuxedo. My audit was officially complete, and the books were finally balanced. The heavy silence inside the massive cathedral was absolute and suffocating. I stood on the highest stone platform of the altar, looking down at the absolute wreckage of my father's fake empire. The echo of my voice reading his handwritten confession had finally faded into the vaulted ceilings of the church, but the shockwave it left behind was practically vibrating in the cold autumn air. 300 of Chicago's most elite socialites sat completely frozen in the polished mahogany pews. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to take a single breath. Every single eye in that cavernous, beautifully decorated room was locked directly on Thomas. Cynthia stood beside him, clutching the original cream-colored stationery in her violently shaking hands. Her perfectly manicured fingernails were digging so deeply into the paper that the edges were beginning to tear. She read the words over and over again, her eyes darting frantically back and forth across the page. I watched the exact moment her brain fully processed the reality of her catastrophic situation. the healthy, vibrant peach color completely drained from her heavily contoured face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. She was a woman drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of aggressive credit card debt, facing massive collection lawsuits, and desperately relying on this marriage to save her from complete financial ruin. She had banked her entire social survival and her lavish estate on the promise that Thomas was a self-made millionaire. But looking at his own handwritten confession, signed with his undeniable signature, the beautiful, glittering illusion evaporated right before her eyes. The man she was about to marry was not a wealthy real estate investor. He was a broke, desperate criminal who was about to face a massive federal indictment for grand larceny. If she married him today, her finances would be permanently anchored to a convicted felon whose accounts were entirely frozen. Cynthia lowered the paper slowly. She turned her head and stared at Thomas. The polite, aristocratic mask she had worn for the past year completely shattered into a million jagged pieces, revealing the vicious, calculating predator hiding underneath. "You lied to me," Cynthia whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of absolute horror and violently escalating rage. Her voice was quiet at first, but it carried perfectly in the dead silence of the cathedral. "You told me you were a multimillionaire. You promised me you were going to pay off the massive mortgages on my estate. You promised me a life of absolute luxury. But you are nothing. You are a common, disgusting thief. You stole $4 million from your own dying wife just to buy a fake ticket into my social circle." Thomas reached his hands out toward her, his face contorted in a mask of pure, groveling panic. "Cynthia, please, darling, you have to listen to me," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically. He was physically backing away from her, terrified of the massive public explosion he knew was coming. "She forced me to write that letter. She threatened me in my private study. It is all completely taken out of context. I have real investments. I have plenty of capital in offshore accounts. We are going to be incredibly wealthy together. You just have to walk down this aisle with me. We can fix absolutely all of this after the ceremony is over. Do not ever speak to me again, you pathetic broke liar." Cynthia screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of high society grace. She reached up with her violently shaking hands and grabbed the massive custom-designed diamond engagement ring sitting heavily on her left finger. She pulled the ring off with such aggressive force that it scraped her knuckle raw. Without a single second of hesitation, she threw the heavy diamond ring directly at my father's chest. The expensive jewelry hit his crisp tuxedo lapel with a sharp thud and bounced off, falling to the cold marble floor with a loud ringing clatter that echoed through the quiet church. It rolled a few feet away and settled near the altar steps, discarded and completely worthless. "This wedding is permanently cancelled," Cynthia announced to the massive crowd, her voice echoing violently across the stone columns. She spun around to face the 300 guests sitting in the pews. "Get out. Everyone leave right now. There is absolutely nothing to celebrate here today. I will not be tying my family name to a disgusting criminal." She turned on her expensive heels, grabbed the heavy silk fabric of her unpaid designer wedding gown, and began marching rapidly down the long center aisle toward the grand exit. She was desperate to escape the disastrous public spectacle, desperate to distance herself from the man who was supposed to be her ultimate golden parachute. But the humiliation for Thomas was not over yet. As Cynthia stormed away, her two arrogant, deeply entitled children leaped forward to take her place. Brad and Chloe had been standing right behind their mother, completely paralyzed by the sudden revelation. But as Cynthia cancelled the wedding and shattered their dreams of unlimited wealth, their shock rapidly morphed into an incredibly embarrassing, highly public tantrum. Brad stepped right up into my father's face, his face flushing a furious shade of bright red. "You absolute fraud," Brad shouted, completely ignoring the hundreds of wealthy guests watching his meltdown. "You promised me capital. You looked me in the eye and promised me you were going to fund my new lifestyle brand by the end of the month. I already signed the lease on a new downtown commercial space because you promised you were going to wire the deposit. How am I supposed to pay for that now? You completely ruined my life." Chloe pushed past her brother, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my father's face. "You promised to pay my rent," she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, grating whine. "I am facing an eviction notice on Monday. You promised me a new car. You promised me an unlimited allowance. You are nothing but a broke, miserable loser. We paraded you around our country club. We introduced you to all of our elite friends. We vouched for you. You completely humiliated our entire family for a fake bank account. I stood on the altar steps, my hands folded neatly in front of me, watching the magnificent poetic justice unfold in real time. These two adult children were entirely exposing their own pathetic parasitic natures to the entire high society crowd. They were loudly confessing that they were nothing but unemployed leeches waiting for a handout, entirely dependent on a man they now realized was a complete fraud. The wealthy politicians, corporate executives, and elite socialites sitting in the pews were watching the beautiful aesthetic of the wedding devolve into a trashy screaming match over unpaid rent and fake investments. Disgusted murmurs began to ripple through the massive crowd. Men in tailored suits shook their heads in absolute revulsion. Women in expensive silk dresses gathered their designer purses and stood up desperate to distance themselves from the toxic fallout. The carefully constructed, flawless reputation Thomas had spent the last 5 years buying with my stolen money was completely burning to the ground. In the elite circles of suburban Chicago, there is absolutely nothing worse than a man who fakes his wealth and steals from his own family. Thomas was instantly, permanently excommunicated from the only world he actually cared about. Brad and Chloe finally ran out of breath. Realizing that the guests were actively fleeing the church and their mother was already out the door, they turned and practically ran down the aisle, fleeing the cathedral like rats abandoning a sinking ship. They left Thomas standing completely alone at the front of the altar. Thomas looked around the massive cavernous room. The beautiful, towering floral arrangements of imported white orchids suddenly looked like tragic decorations for a funeral. The string quartet had packed up their instruments and vanished. The hundreds of guests were actively pouring out the heavy oak doors at the back of the church, refusing to make eye contact with him. His fake aristocratic family had completely abandoned him without a second thought. The entire glittering empire he had built on stolen money and calculated lies had completely disintegrated into ash right in front of his eyes. He turned his head slowly and looked up at me. His eyes were completely hollow, filled with a dark, suffocating realization. He had traded his real daughter, the one who had actually loved him and worked herself to the bone, to save him for a group of greedy parasites who dropped him the absolute second the money disappeared. "You ruined everything," he whispered, his voice cracking with defeated, pathetic rage. He took a weak, trembling step toward me. "You destroyed my entire life over a piece of paper. I did not ruin anything, Thomas." I replied, my voice ringing with the absolute uncompromising certainty of justice. "You ruined your own life the exact second you brought a fake notary into my mother's hospital room. I am simply the auditor who finally balanced your ledger." Before Thomas could utter another desperate word, a loud, heavy sound echoed from the back of the cathedral. The massive, solid oak double doors swung open with a forceful, echoing crash. The few remaining guests lingering in the back pews quickly scrambled out of the way. Walking straight down the center aisle, moving with deliberate, unyielding authority, was Richard Hayes. The notorious financial crimes attorney was wearing a sharp, dark suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase. He was not alone. Flanking him on either side were 4 uniformed police officers, accompanied by 2 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers. The heavy, rhythmic sound of their boots marching against the polished marble floor echoed loudly through the completely silent church. The visual contrast was absolutely staggering. The beautiful, holy setting of the cathedral, decorated with pristine white towel and glowing candles, was suddenly invaded by the cold, harsh reality of the criminal justice system. Thomas froze entirely. His body stiffened and his eyes widened in sheer primal terror as he watched the officers march directly toward him. The last remaining drops of his arrogant pride vanished completely. He instinctively took a step backward, bumping heavily into the polished wooden steps of the altar. Richard Hayes stopped exactly 3 feet away from my father. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of official court-stamped documents. He looked at Thomas with an expression of pure professional contempt. "Thomas Myers," Hayes announced, his deep, commanding voice filling the entire vaulted space of the church. "I am Richard Hayes, legal counsel representing your daughter, Clara Myers. I hold in my hand an emergency federal injunction signed by a federal judge exactly 24 hours ago. Every single bank account, investment portfolio, and line of credit bearing your name has been completely and permanently frozen. Furthermore, the $4 million trust you illegally accessed has been fully confiscated and secured by the federal court. You have absolutely zero access to any financial assets. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, to deny the charges, to beg for mercy, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer overwhelming magnitude of the legal siege. The lead federal agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. Thomas Myers, the agent, said clearly, "You are hereby placed under arrest for massive wire fraud, grand larceny, identity theft, and the forgery of legal authorization documents. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The reality of the words crashed down on Thomas's mind with the devastating force of a massive avalanche. The man who had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to project an image of untouchable power and massive wealth was suddenly reduced to a trembling, broken criminal. His knees completely gave out beneath him. Thomas collapsed onto the cold marble floor of the cathedral. He fell hard onto his knees right next to the discarded diamond engagement ring Cynthia had thrown at his chest. His expensive custom-tailored tuxedo pulled awkwardly around his legs. He lowered his head, his shoulders shaking with violent, completely silent sobs. The federal agent stepped up behind him, grabbed his arms firmly, and clicked the cold steel handcuffs securely around his wrists. The sharp metallic snapping sound echoed loudly in the empty church, a final definitive period at the end of his fraudulent story. I stood on the highest step of the altar and looked down at him. I watched the police officers haul him to his feet. He looked incredibly small. He looked pathetic. He had lost absolutely everything. He had lost his fake high society bride. He had lost the unearned respect of his elite peers. He had lost his stolen millions. He had lost his honor, and now he had permanently lost his freedom. As the officers turned him around to march him down the long center aisle toward the waiting police cruisers outside, Thomas lifted his head one last time and looked back at me over his shoulder. His eyes were red, swollen, and filled with a profound, crushing sorrow. He finally realized the massive, undeniable weight of his own monstrous greed. He had meticulously built a magnificent house of cards on a foundation of absolute lies, and he had foolishly forced the only person who actually knew how to count the cards out into the cold. I did not offer him a single shred of sympathy. I did not look away. I held his gaze perfectly steady until the heavy oak doors of the cathedral swung shut behind him, sealing him out of my life forever. The church was finally completely empty. The overwhelming silence returned, but this time it was not suffocating. It was incredibly peaceful. The heavy, dark shadow that had hung over my life for 15 long years was permanently lifted. My mother's legacy was fully protected. My stolen inheritance was legally secured, and the man who had tried to destroy me was currently sitting in the back of a federal squad car. Richard Hayes walked up the steps and stood beside me, looking toward the closed doors. He closed his leather briefcase and gave a single satisfied nod. "The audit is officially closed, Clara," he said quietly. "We got everything back." I took a deep, clean breath of the cool air inside the cathedral. I looked down at my own hands, completely steady and strong. I had not broken under the weight of his psychological abuse. I had not surrendered to his arrogant threats in the dark alley. I had stood my ground, verified the facts, and let the undeniable truth burn the lies to the ground. "I am ready to go home," I said. I walked slowly down the marble steps of the altar, leaving the discarded diamond ring and the crushed white orchids behind me. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the bright, beautiful Chicago afternoon. The cold wind brushed against my face, but I finally felt incredibly warm. I was completely free. 6 months later, the bitter, freezing autumn winds of Chicago have completely surrendered to a bright, vibrant, and incredibly warm spring. I am sitting on the spacious balcony of my new high-rise apartment, looking out over the vast, sparkling blue expanse of Lake Michigan. I am holding a warm ceramic mug of dark roast coffee in my hands. There are no more terrifying, freezing nights spent huddled inside a thin nylon tent in the unforgiving mountains of the Himalayas. There are no more cramped, depressing administrative bunkers in rural Japan. There is no more eating cheap instant noodles while frantically auditing corrupt corporate ledgers in a blind panic just to save a man who was actively stealing from me. The deep, heavy silence in my life is no longer filled with suffocating anxiety or constant dread. It is filled with absolute unbroken and magnificent peace. The profound contrast between the miserable, exhausted girl I used to be and the calm, powerful woman I am today is absolutely staggering. For the first time in 15 years, I actually sleep deeply through the entire night. The justice system moves with a slow, grinding inevitability when it comes to complex, white-collar financial crimes, but my father had practically handed the federal prosecutors his own criminal conviction wrapped in a neat, perfect bow. He did not even make it to a long, drawn-out and highly publicized trial. Faced with the overwhelming mountain of undeniable forensic evidence, our legal team had painstakingly gathered the perfectly documented paper trail of the stolen trust funds, the fraudulent power of attorney from the hospital, and his own highly detailed handwritten confession. His expensive defense attorney strongly advised him to take a formal plea deal. Thomas is currently serving a 72-month sentence in a high-security federal correctional institution. The arrogant man who once obsessed endlessly over custom-tailored luxury suits, imported white orchids, and elite country club memberships now wears a cheap standard-issue canvas uniform. His entire glittering high society world has been permanently reduced to cold concrete walls, steel bars, and incredibly rigid daily schedules. There are no grand mahogany foyers for him to pace back and forth in. There are no wealthy aristocratic widows for him to impress with his fake charm and his stolen bank accounts. He is completely isolated from the luxurious life he destroyed his own family to obtain. Cynthia and her entitled parasitic children vanished into thin air the absolute second his bank accounts were officially frozen by the federal judge. They never looked back. They never sent him a single letter of comfort. They completely abandoned him, exactly the way he had once abandoned his own grieving daughter. The profound, tragic irony of his situation is that he violently threw away the only person on earth who actually loved him unconditionally, and he traded her for shallow, greedy people who only loved his stolen money. Taking official legal control of my mother's inheritance was an incredibly surreal and deeply emotional experience. After several long months of working closely with Richard Hayes and navigating the complex probate courts, the entire $4 million trust was finally transferred back into its rightful secure accounts under my name. But there was still one massive piece of unfinished business lingering in the background: the sprawling colonial estate in the affluent northern suburbs. The massive house Thomas had purchased using my inheritance to project his fake billionaire facade to the world. To satisfy the remaining financial damages and court-ordered restitution, the bank formally turned the physical deed of the property over to me. I drove up that long, perfectly paved circular driveway one last time on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and stepped slowly into the grand foyer. The house was completely silent and entirely empty. The expensive imported furniture, the glittering crystal chandeliers, the priceless Persian rugs, it had all been systematically liquidated by the estate liquidators to pay back the stolen funds. I walked slowly through the echoing vacant rooms. I stood in the doorway of his private study, where he had aggressively screamed at me, where he had viciously threatened to destroy my auditing career and ban me from his life. Standing there in the empty room, I realized that I did not feel any lingering anger. I did not feel any residual fear or intimidation. The walls were just plaster paint and wood. The house held absolutely nothing but toxic, poisonous memories of a man who had consistently treated me like a disposable financial resource. I knew immediately that I did not want to live there. I did not want to keep the massive estate as some sort of triumphant revenge trophy. Keeping the house would mean permanently holding on to a dark, heavy monument built entirely on lies, manipulation, and profound psychological abuse. So I sold it without a single second of hesitation. I listed the massive property on the real estate market, sold it for a significant profit to a wonderful young family who had absolutely no idea about its dark, deceptive history. And I washed my hands of his physical legacy forever. Sitting in the lawyer's office and signing those final closing papers felt exactly like finally exhaling a massive, heavy breath I had been unconsciously holding inside my chest for 15 long years. I suddenly found myself an incredibly wealthy woman at 28 years old. Between the fully recovered trust fund and the lucrative sale of the colonial estate, I had a massive fortune sitting securely in my investment accounts. It was a fortune that was originally meant to be my lifelong safety net. But as an auditor who spends every single day looking at the flow of capital, I knew exactly what a massive pile of unearned money could do to a person if it was simply hoarded out of blind greed. I had watched that exact same greed completely rot my father's soul from the inside out until there was absolutely nothing human left. I deeply wanted this money to build something beautiful, lasting, and meaningful. I wanted to use this immense privilege to honor the woman who had actually loved me, the mother who had tried so desperately to protect my future before her tragic death. I took a highly significant portion of the recovered financial funds and established a permanent, fully funded educational endowment. I proudly created the Sarah Myers Memorial Scholarship Fund. The scholarship is specifically and carefully designed to provide comprehensive full-ride university funding to young women who are completely financially independent. It is a lifeline for women who do not have the basic safety net of a supportive, loving family. It is for the brilliant, determined girls who have been painfully rejected, abandoned, or forced to survive entirely on their own in a world that constantly overlooks them. Every single time I sit at my desk and review a new batch of hopeful applications, every time I sign an official award letter granting a struggling young woman the absolute freedom to pursue her higher education without the crushing, suffocating weight of student debt, I feel my mother's warm, comforting presence standing right beside me. I successfully turned the deepest, most agonizing betrayal of my entire life into a living, breathing legacy of hope and empowerment. Thomas used my mother's sacred money to buy a fake, fleeting illusion of power and aristocratic dominance. I am using that exact same money to buy young, deserving women their bright, limitless futures. That is the ultimate, most profoundly satisfying victory I could ever possibly achieve. Despite my massive new financial independence, I did not quit my demanding job as a senior financial auditor. A lot of my colleagues and acquaintances simply assumed I would retire extremely early, buy a luxury yacht, and spend the rest of my days lounging aimlessly on a tropical white sand beach. But auditing is not just a corporate job to me. It is a fundamental core part of my identity. It is the exact analytical skill set that saved my life, unraveled the deceptive mystery, and successfully exposed the greedy monsters hiding in the dark corners of my own family. I proudly returned to my prestigious accounting firm, but my entire psychological mindset had completely shifted. I no longer walked into hostile, high-pressure corporate boardrooms as a tired, desperate, terrified girl simply trying to earn enough overseas hazard pay to keep the lights on back home. I walked through those heavy glass doors as a powerful, grounded woman who had single-handedly taken down a multi-million-dollar fraudster using absolutely nothing but cold logic, verified evidence, and absolute unwavering emotional control. I no longer accept the punishing, dangerous overseas contracts in freezing, isolated geographical locations. I work entirely on my own terms. I choose the complex cases that actually matter to me. I look corrupt, arrogant corporate executives directly in the eye across the negotiation table, and I absolutely do not flinch or look away when they raise their voices or viciously threaten my professional reputation. Because once you have bravely stood your ground against the terrifying rage of your own father, and once you have calmly watched his magnificent fake empire burn completely to the ground, an angry corporate chief executive officer in a tailored designer suit does not intimidate you in the slightest. Looking back at the incredibly long, grueling journey from that rainy Tuesday morning inside the bank vault to this bright, beautiful spring day on my balcony, I have learned a profound, absolute truth about the complex nature of family and the critical importance of personal boundaries. Society constantly conditions us from a very young age to believe that biological blood is an unbreakable sacred bond. We are routinely taught by our culture to forgive endlessly, to quietly swallow our pain, and to constantly sacrifice our own mental well-being, our own sanity, and our own hard-earned resources just to keep the fragile peace within the family unit. We are constantly told that setting firm, uncompromising boundaries with our parents or siblings is a cruel, unnatural, and deeply selfish act. But I am here to tell you that is a massive manipulative lie deliberately designed to keep victims entirely compliant and silent. Boundaries are not an act of cruelty or malice. They are the ultimate, most essential expression of basic self-respect. You absolutely do not owe anyone a senseless, agonizing lifelong sacrifice, even if they happen to share your exact last name or your biological DNA. You do not owe your fleeting youth, your physical health, or your precious financial stability to parents who consistently treat you like a disposable, convenient asset to fund their own selfish desires. True authentic family is built entirely on a solid foundation of mutual respect, genuine honesty, and unconditional emotional support. It is absolutely not a cold, calculating transactional arrangement where a parent's love and basic approval are strictly tied to what you can physically or financially provide for them. When my father aggressively demanded my permanent silence in that dark alley just to protect his fake, glittering life, he proved undeniably that his fragile ego and his public image mattered vastly more to him than the safety and happiness of his own daughter. Choosing to finally walk away from that toxicity, choosing to drop the incredibly heavy, suffocating burden of his endless financial expectations was not a betrayal of my family. It was a necessary, beautiful act of profound self-preservation. Sometimes, the very people who are supposed to naturally love and protect you are the exact ones you need the most urgent protection from. You have the absolute, undeniable right to demand the clear truth. You have the right to bravely balance the complex ledger of your own life. And you have the fundamental right to permanently close the door on absolutely anyone who brings deception, pain, and toxicity into your peaceful, hard-earned world. You are allowed to stop setting yourself on fire just to keep other people warm. You are allowed to finally choose yourself. If you have ever had to cut ties with a toxic relative to protect yourself, you are not alone. Sometimes the hardest step is the one that leads to freedom. Please like and subscribe to the channel to spread this story to those who need more strength. And do not forget to leave a comment letting me know which state you are watching this video from and what time it is. Your support is what motivates me to continue sharing stories about justice. See you soon.